Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're stepping into an era when a woman could be told, in the space of a single television commercial, that her marriage was in danger because of the wrong brand of coffee. Welcome to the 1950s, the golden age of American advertising, when a housewife's entire sense of worth could be measured in the shine of her kitchen floor, the whiteness of her husband's collar, and the number of jingles she could hum before breakfast. Tonight's story isn't about a single product or a single ad campaign. It's about an entire system, a quiet, relentless machine built by admen in gray flannel suits who figured out something extraordinary, that they didn't need to sell soap or cereal or floor wax. They needed to sell fear, hope, love, and belonging, and let the products ride along for free. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this kind of deep, slow storytelling, consider subscribing, but only if it actually helps you unwind. Drop a comment and tell me the strangest thing an advertisement has ever convinced you to buy. Or if you're listening at 3 in the morning, tell me which old commercial jingle is still rattling around in your head after all these years. Now settle in, dim the lights, let your body sink into the mattress, and let's drift together into the world of 1950s Madison Avenue, where the American housewife wasn't just a customer. She was a target, a test subject, and unknowingly, a soldier in a war fought entirely with jingles, packaging, and psychology. It's just past 6 in the morning in a quiet American suburb, sometime in 1956. The alarm clock on the nightstand doesn't just ring. It chimes with the manufactured cheerfulness of a product designed by people who had never actually experienced a groggy, bleary-eyed human being trying to face a Tuesday. That alarm clock itself was sold to her with a promise. Wake up brighter, wake up better. Wake up like the woman in the advertisement who always seemed to spring out of bed with her hair already set and her lipstick somehow already applied. She blinks at the ceiling for a moment, caught in that strange fog between sleep and consciousness, and somewhere in the back of her mind, before she's even fully awake, a jingle is already playing. She didn't choose to think of it. It simply arrived, planted there sometime yesterday by a 30-second spot on the radio, waiting patiently through 8 hours of sleep to greet her the moment her mind switched back on. This was not an accident. This was the entire point. By the 1950s, the American advertising industry had grown into something almost unrecognizable from what it had been just 2 decades before. During the Depression, advertising had been about necessity. Buy this because you need it, because it's cheaper, because it will last. But by the post-war years, something had shifted. Factories that had spent the war years building tanks and airplanes now needed something else to build. Store shelves that had been rationed and half-empty for years were suddenly overflowing with washing machines, refrigerators, canned goods, synthetic fabrics, and 1,000 new inventions nobody had asked for but everyone would soon believe they couldn't live without. The problem admen faced wasn't scarcity anymore. It was abundance. And abundance, it turned out, was a much harder thing to sell. So the industry did something remarkably clever and more than a little unsettling. Instead of selling products based on what they did, they began selling products based on what they meant. A refrigerator wasn't just a box that kept food cold. It was a badge of modernity, a way of announcing to the neighborhood that your family had arrived, that you were keeping pace with progress itself. A particular brand of soap wasn't just for washing. It was insurance against social embarrassment, a shield against the quiet judgment of neighbors, mothers-in-law, and PTA committees. And the housewife, more than anyone else in the household, became the single most valuable customer in American history, because she was the one standing at the checkout counter for nearly every purchase the family made. She sits up now, feeling the tightness of pin curls against her scalp, because even her hair had to be product-ready by morning, courtesy of a home permanent kit purchased after a magazine advertisement promised salon results for a fraction of the price, and roughly none of the mess the box implied. The room around her is a small museum of purchases made not out of pure necessity, but out of a slow, cumulative surrender to years of carefully engineered suggestion. The curtains, chosen because a decorating spread in a women's magazine insisted that gingham said warmth and honesty. The vanity mirror, angled just so, framed by a set of cosmetics purchased because a full-page ad swore that 10 years could vanish from her face if she simply committed to the nightly ritual, religiously, without fail, the way a good wife ought to commit to anything that mattered. She catches her reflection, and without quite realizing she's doing it, arranges her face into the same soft, composed expression she has seen 100 times on 100 actresses selling 100 different products. Advertisers had a name for this look. They called it the sincere smile, the expression a woman was supposed to wear when handing her husband his morning coffee or her children their fortified cereal, an expression so carefully studied and so endlessly repeated across print ads and television spots that real women, without any training at all, had begun to perform it unconsciously in their own kitchens. This is one of the quieter triumphs of 1950s advertising, one rarely discussed in textbooks. It didn't just sell products. It sold behavior. It sold posture, tone of voice, facial expression, even the rhythm of a woman's morning routine, until the line between the advertisement and the life it was supposedly only describing became almost impossible to find. Downstairs, the kitchen radio is already on, because the radio, like the television that would soon dominate the living room, was rarely silent in a 1950s home. Silence, after all, was a wasted opportunity, an unsold half-minute in which no product could plant itself in anyone's mind. The announcer's voice, warm and paternal, transitions seamlessly from a peppy tune into a pitch for a brand of coffee that promises, in the space of about 20 seconds, to deliver energy, flavor, family togetherness, and something the ad copywriters vaguely but confidently called that Sunday morning feeling, even though it is, in fact, a Tuesday. She fills the percolator without really listening to the words anymore. She doesn't need to. The melody alone is enough to trigger the purchase, months later at the grocery store, when her hand will reach for that brand and no other, guided by a memory she won't even consciously register. This was the genius and the danger of what researchers at the time were beginning to call motivational research, a discipline that borrowed heavily from psychology and psychoanalysis to understand not what people said they wanted, but what they actually, secretly wanted, often for reasons they themselves couldn't articulate. One of the most influential figures in this movement was a man who had trained in Vienna under thinkers steeped in the ideas of Freud, and who brought those ideas directly into American boardrooms. He argued, controversially but persuasively, that people didn't buy products for logical reasons. They bought them for emotional ones, buried ones, ones tied to guilt, status anxiety, sexual insecurity, and the deep, aching human need to belong. A cake mix wasn't just flour and sugar in a box. If a housewife felt too little ownership over the process, if it felt too easy, she would feel guilty, as though she hadn't really contributed anything to her family's happiness. So the solution wasn't to make cake mix easier. It was to make it slightly harder, requiring her to add her own egg, so that she could feel, however manufactured that feeling might be, that she had truly baked something with her own hands and her own love. It's a small, almost absurd detail, the egg requirement in a boxed cake mix, and yet it reveals something enormous about the entire advertising apparatus of the decade. Nothing was left to chance. Every element of a product, from its name to its packaging to the exact phrasing on the box, was tested, refined, and adjusted based on a growing science of persuasion that treated the American housewife not as a rational shopper comparing prices, but as a bundle of anxieties waiting to be soothed, for a price, aisle by aisle, week after week. She pours the coffee, dark and steaming, into 2 cups, one for herself and one that will sit waiting for her husband, who has not yet appeared but whose presence is already anticipated in the careful arrangement of the kitchen. The table is set with a precision that borders on ceremonial. Napkins folded into neat triangles. A small pitcher of milk positioned just so. A bowl of fruit, mostly for appearance, because the advertisements that inspired this table setting were themselves staged for appearance, photographed under studio lighting, arranged by professional stylists whose entire job was to make an ordinary breakfast look like a small, achievable miracle. She has never seen behind the scenes of one of these advertisements. She has no idea that the glistening bowl of cereal photographed for a magazine spread was likely filled not with milk but with white glue, because real milk would have made the flakes go soggy under the hot studio lights before the photographer could get his shot. She simply absorbed the image, the way millions of women absorbed thousands of similar images, and quietly, without ever being told to, began measuring her own kitchen against a fiction built by lighting technicians and food stylists who had never once eaten breakfast in that room. Her children thundered down the stairs, already dressed, already hungry, already primed by an hour of Saturday morning cartoons and their accompanying commercials to demand a very specific brand of cereal, one whose mascot they can name faster than they can name their own teacher. This, too, was not accidental. The 1950s marked the beginning of something advertisers themselves would later describe, with a mixture of pride and unease, as pest or power, the deliberate strategy of marketing directly to children, not because children had any money of their own, but because children, once sufficiently persuaded, would nag, plead, and wear down the adults who did. A cereal company didn't need to convince a mother that sugar-frosted flakes were nutritious. It only needed to convince her 5-year-old that a cartoon tiger was his personal friend, and the rest of the sale would take care of itself at the breakfast table, in the form of a small, insistent voice repeating the same request in 100 different ways until she gave in out of sheer exhaustion. She pours the cereal anyway because it's easier than the argument, and watches her son examine the small plastic prize buried somewhere in the box, a prize that cost the manufacturer almost nothing to produce but had been the deciding factor, according to their own market research, in nearly a third of all cereal purchases made by families with children under 10. The cereal itself, meanwhile, sits in a box covered in nutritional claims so bold and so confident that a passing glance might convince you it was less a breakfast food and more a kind of miracle tonic, fortified, enriched, vitamin-packed, energy-building, claims that were, at the time, only loosely regulated, allowing manufacturers enormous latitude in describing exactly how transformative a bowl of sweetened corn flakes might be for a growing child's body and mind. Her husband finally appears, tie already knotted, newspaper already tucked under one arm, and settles into his chair with the practiced efficiency of a man who has performed this exact sequence of movements every weekday morning for years. He, too, is a target audience, though a different one, courted by an entirely separate category of advertisement built around masculinity, ambition, and the quiet terror of falling behind one's peers. His razor, his aftershave, his suit, even the brand of cigarette resting in his shirt pocket, each had been marketed to him using a completely different emotional register than the ads aimed at his wife. Where the advertisements targeting her leaned on guilt, beauty, and domestic anxiety, the advertisements targeting him leaned on confidence, virility, and status, the unspoken suggestion that the right products would make him not just presentable, but formidable, a man other men would respect and women would admire. He unfolds the newspaper and disappears behind it, and for a moment the kitchen falls into something resembling quiet, interrupted only by the clink of spoons against cereal bowls and the low murmur of the radio, still faithfully delivering its next commercial. This one for a laundry detergent promising whiteness so pure it could restore not just a shirt, but, if the tone of the announcer is to be believed, a marriage itself. She listens without quite listening, the way you might hear rain against a window, present but unremarkable, and yet somewhere in the deep architecture of her mind, a small note is being filed away for her next trip to the grocery store, a note she will not consciously remember making. This was, perhaps, the single most important discovery of 1950s advertising, one that would go on to shape marketing for the rest of the 20th century and well beyond. Repetition didn't need to be interesting to be effective. It didn't even need to be consciously noticed. A jingle heard 50 times over the course of a month would outperform a brilliant, memorable advertisement seen only once, because the human brain, it turned out, was far more persuadable through sheer familiarity than through cleverness. This is why the radio, and soon the television, played the same handful of commercials over and over, dozens of times a day, until viewers and listeners could recite them without ever having tried to memorize a single word. The goal was never delight. The goal was saturation, a kind of gentle, tireless psychological siege conducted 30 seconds at a time, breakfast after breakfast, until resistance simply wore away. We'll continue exploring this world in the next part of tonight's story, moving from the breakfast table out into the world of daytime radio, the traveling salesman at the front door, the seductive glow of the department store window, and the quiet, careful science behind the advertisements that shaped an entire generation of American households. For now, let the kitchen radio hum, let the coffee cool slowly in its cup, and let yourself rest here a moment longer in 1956, in a world where every product promised just a little more happiness than the one before it. By mid-morning, the dishes are washed, the children are off to school, and the house settles into that particular quiet that belongs only to a suburban weekday, a quiet that advertisers had long since identified as one of the most valuable, most vulnerable stretches of a housewife's entire day. If breakfast had been about family and routine, mid-morning was about her, or at least about the version of her that the admen had decided she secretly wished to become. The radio, still playing in the background, shifts tone almost imperceptibly. The peppy jingles of the breakfast hour give way to something softer, slower, more intimate, the kind of voice a friend might use, low and confiding, as though the announcer had leaned in close just to speak to her alone. This was deliberate, and it was the product of years of careful study into exactly who was listening to daytime radio and why. Survey after survey conducted by the networks and their advertising partners confirmed what many had already suspected. The daytime audience was overwhelmingly female, overwhelmingly alone in the house, and overwhelmingly starved for a particular kind of companionship that the medium was uniquely positioned to provide. A woman scrubbing a countertop or folding a basket of laundry wasn't watching a screen. She was listening, half present, her hands busy and her mind free to wander, which made her, according to internal industry memos of the era, an almost perfect audience for a specific kind of persuasion, one built less on spectacle and more on intimacy, trust, and the slow, patient cultivation of a parasocial friendship between a woman and a voice she had never met and never would. Enter the serial drama, the daytime program that would later earn the enduring nickname soap opera, a title that stuck precisely because the entire genre had been built, financed, and shaped from its very first broadcast by the detergent and soap manufacturers who sponsored it. These companies didn't simply buy advertising space around an existing show. In many cases, they created the show itself, hearing the writers, approving the plotlines, and shaping the emotional rhythm of each episode to maximize the effectiveness of the commercials embedded within it. A storyline might be deliberately paused at its most emotionally charged moment. A confession, a betrayal, a long-lost relative revealed at the door, specifically because research had shown that a listener's attention and emotional openness peaked at exactly that instant, making her far more receptive to the advertisement that followed than she would have been at any calmer point in the story. She dries her hands on her apron and settles for a moment at the kitchen table, letting herself be pulled into the familiar rhythm of a program she has followed for months, maybe years. The characters feel, in some strange way, more real to her than some of her actual neighbors because she has spent more consistent, more emotionally engaged time with them. 15 minutes at a stretch, 5 days a week, month after month, than she has with almost anyone else in her daily life. This was precisely the relationship the advertisers wanted her to have, not with the characters exactly, but with the products that interrupted them. The same soft, trusted voice that had just delivered a devastating plot twist would, moments later, deliver a gentle, personal-sounding pitch for a laundry powder, and the emotional residue of the drama, the tears, the tension, the relief, would bleed seamlessly into her receptiveness toward the product, exactly as the sponsors had intended. It is worth pausing here to appreciate just how deliberate and how scientific this entire system had become by the middle of the decade. Advertising agencies employed psychologists, sociologists, and even former academics from fields like anthropology to study the American housewife with the same rigor a naturalist might apply to an unfamiliar species. Focus groups were conducted in living rooms specially wired with hidden recording equipment. Women were shown different versions of the same advertisement and asked not just what they thought, but how the advertisement made them feel. A subtle but crucial distinction that admen had come to understand was the real currency of persuasion. It didn't matter whether a housewife could rationally defend her preference for one brand of margarine over another. What mattered was that one brand made her feel like a good mother, and the other, through no real difference in the product itself, simply didn't. Outside, mid-morning gives way to early afternoon, and the doorbell rings with the particular insistence of a man who has been trained to believe that persistence itself is a virtue. The door-to-door salesman was, by 1956, less an occasional visitor and more a fixture of suburban life, a role so common that entire training manuals existed to teach young men, fresh out of the war or fresh out of high school, exactly how to stand on a housewife's front step, exactly what tone of voice to use, exactly how to angle their body so as to seem unthreatening while still, subtly, making it difficult for the door to close. She opens it, and there he is, hair combed with almost mathematical precision, suit slightly too warm for the weather, a leather case at his side containing whatever miracle he has been assigned to sell this particular season, a vacuum cleaner, perhaps, or a set of encyclopedias, or the latest in a long line of kitchen gadgets promising to save her time she didn't know she was losing. His opening line is rehearsed but delivered with the practiced ease of something he believes, in the moment at least, to be entirely spontaneous. He asks her a question she cannot easily answer no to. Something about whether she has ever wished her mornings were a little easier, or whether she has ever worried about the safety of her family, a question engineered not to gather information, but to secure a small, almost imperceptible commitment. The first of several, the sales training manuals referred to as stepping stones, each one making the eventual larger commitment, the actual purchase, feel like a small and reasonable continuation of everything she had already agreed to. This technique, now studied extensively in the science of persuasion under names like the foot-in-the-door effect, was already well understood by traveling salesmen in the 1950s, even if they didn't have the academic vocabulary for it. Get a small yes, then another, and by the fourth or fifth small yes, the big yes, the signature on the order form felt less like a decision and more like an inevitability. She stands in her doorway, half listening, half watching the clock, aware that the roast needs attention and the laundry is only half finished, and yet something about his rehearsed confidence, his easy charm, and the sheer volume of features he has managed to describe in under 2 minutes leaves her feeling, against her better judgment, that saying no might somehow reflect poorly on her, as though refusing this vacuum cleaner were a small failure of judgment rather than simply a decision about household spending. Not every visit ends in a sale, of course, and the salesmen of the era knew this better than anyone. Rejection was, for them, not the exception but the daily norm, and an entire subculture of resilience and self-motivation had grown up around the profession, complete with pep talks, sales contests, and company newsletters celebrating the top performers of the month with the kind of fervor usually reserved for war heroes. But even a failed sale, wasn't entirely wasted from the company's perspective. Every doorstep conversation was, in its own small way, another data point, another chance to plant a brand name in a housewife's memory, so that even if she declined the vacuum today, she might find herself, weeks later, standing in a department store, drawn inexplicably toward that same name on a box, the salesman's visit having done exactly what a well-placed magazine advertisement might have done, quietly, cumulatively, without her ever quite realizing the connection. By early afternoon, if the salesman has gone and the chores allow for it, she might make her way to the shopping district, a short drive or bus ride from the quiet residential streets into the bright, bustling heart of downtown, where department store windows had become, by the middle of the decade, something closer to theater than to simple product display. The great department stores of the era employed full-time window dressers, artists in their own right, who treated each pane of glass as a small stage set, complete with lighting, props, and a narrative arc designed to stop a passerby in her tracks and hold her attention for just long enough to plant the seed of a want that hadn't existed 30 seconds earlier. She pauses in front of one such window now, drawn by a mannequin dressed in the latest style of shirtwaist dress, arranged alongside a table set with gleaming dishware and a small placard describing, in elegant script, the complete look for the modern American home. The scene is engineered down to the smallest detail. The lighting has been calibrated to make the fabric of the dress catch the eye from across the street. The mannequin's pose has been chosen to suggest ease and effortless grace, rather than the rigid formality of earlier decades. Even the placement of a single vase of flowers has been debated, adjusted, and finalized by someone whose entire job title involved understanding exactly how a human eye moves across a display, and exactly where it needs to be gently redirected. Inside, the department store itself continues the performance. Aisles are arranged not for efficiency, but for a kind of guided wandering, designed to draw a shopper past as many tempting displays as possible on her way to whatever single item she had originally come to purchase. Perfume counters, staffed by women trained to offer a sample the moment a potential customer's gaze lingers even a second too long, are positioned near the entrance, precisely because the scent, once applied, created a small physical commitment that made walking away feel oddly wasteful. Sales signs, marked down from prices that had sometimes never actually been charged in the first place, created a manufactured sense of urgency and scarcity. The suggestion that this particular bargain, this exact dress or hat or set of gloves, might not be available tomorrow, encouraging a purchase today that might otherwise have waited or never happened at all. She moves through the store with a list in her handbag, a modest, practical list written that morning with genuine intentions of restraint. And yet by the time she reaches the register, the list has grown, item by item, nudged along by 100 small persuasions she never consciously registered as persuasion at all. A new shade of lipstick, purchased not because her old one had run out, but because a magazine advertisement that week had insisted that this particular color was the secret ingredient missing from her evening routine. A set of matching kitchen towels, purchased because they were positioned directly beside the cash register, in the exact spot retail consultants of the era had already identified as the most effective location for impulse purchases, the last few feet before a customer's attention shifted entirely toward paying and leaving. This is, in many ways, the quiet heartbeat of the entire advertising machine of the 1950s, the transformation of desire from something a person generated internally, based on genuine need, into something manufactured externally, through image, repetition, and carefully studied psychology, and then presented back to the consumer as though it had been her own idea all along. She would never describe her afternoon at the department store as the result of a carefully orchestrated campaign of persuasion. She would describe it, if asked, simply as a pleasant outing, a chance to treat herself, a small reward for the week's labor. And in a sense, she would be right. The genius of the system was precisely that it never felt like manipulation from the inside. It felt like choice, like taste, like personality, even as every element of the environment around her had been constructed, tested, and refined by people whose entire profession was built around making manufactured desire indistinguishable from authentic want. We'll continue this story from here, moving into the afternoon hours, the arrival of television as the dominant force in American advertising, the strange and telling story of the Tupperware Party, and the growing anxieties that would eventually spark the first real backlash against the industry that had, for the better part of a decade, quietly rewritten the rules of American desire. By the middle of the decade, a new machine had taken up residence in nearly every American living room, and it would, within just a few short years, change the entire architecture of persuasion more completely than radio, print, or the traveling salesman ever had. Television. In 1950, only a small fraction of American households owned a set. By 1956, the number had climbed past 30 million, an explosion so rapid that manufacturers could barely keep pace with demand. And advertisers, sensing an opportunity unlike anything they had encountered before, scrambled to understand exactly how to use this strange new box of moving light and sound to their advantage. Radio had asked listeners to imagine. A jingle about a gleaming white shirt required the listener's own mind to conjure the image of that shirt, that whiteness, that satisfaction. Television removed the imagining entirely. It simply showed you, in vivid, moving detail, the shirt itself, blindingly white, held up by a beaming actress in a kitchen so clean it seemed to glow from within. This was, admen quickly realized, an almost unfair advantage. The human brain, it turned out, responded to moving images with a kind of automatic, almost involuntary attention that no printed page or radio jingle could fully replicate. A woman folding laundry with the television on wasn't just half listening the way she might have been with the radio. Her eyes were drawn, again and again, back to the screen, pulled by movement, by color, by the simple magnetic pull of a picture that changed every few seconds. She settles onto the sofa in the evening now, the dinner dishes finally cleared, her husband in his chair with the newspaper folded on his lap, her children sprawled on the floor in their pajamas, and together they watch the console glow to life in the corner of the room. What follows is not, strictly speaking, entertainment interrupted by commercials. In the earliest years of television advertising, the relationship was closer to the reverse. Entertainment existing almost as a courtesy wrapped around the commercial, a reward offered to the viewer for enduring and hopefully absorbing the sales pitch. Many of the most popular programs of the era were named directly after their sponsors. A woman watching a particular hour of programming wasn't watching a neutral show that happened to carry advertisements. She was, in a very real sense, watching an hour-long advertisement for a single company, produced, funded, and shaped from beginning to end by that company's marketing department, with entertainment serving as the delivery mechanism rather than the product itself. This arrangement gave sponsors an almost frightening degree of control. If a storyline made a company uncomfortable, if a character's behavior seemed to reflect poorly on the values the sponsor wished to associate with its brand, the sponsor could, and often did, demand changes. Writers learned quickly which topics were simply untouchable, not because of network standards or government regulation, but because a detergent company or a cigarette manufacturer had decided a particular plotline might make audiences uneasy in a way that could bleed over into their purchasing decisions. The sponsor's name appeared not just before and after the program but often within it, woven into the very title, the host's introduction, and sometimes even the dialogue itself, in the kind of seamless product integration that would later be rediscovered and celebrated by a new generation of marketers decades later, as though it were a novel invention rather than a rerun of a very old idea. Within the commercials themselves, An entirely new visual language was being invented in real time, often through trial and error, sometimes through outright deception that would be unthinkable, or at least illegal, by later standards. The famous case of a certain shaving cream advertisement, which claimed its product could shave sandpaper smooth in a single application, became legendary not for its success, but for the scandal that followed when it was revealed the demonstration on screen hadn't used sandpaper at all, but a sheet of plexiglass with sand loosely scattered on top, a substance far easier to shave clean than the actual sandpaper the advertisement claimed to be using. The controversy, when it eventually reached regulators, marked one of the earliest moments in which the American public began to question, publicly and collectively, whether what they saw on their television screens could be trusted at all. But in 1956, that reckoning is still years away, and for now, she watches the demonstration with the same quiet, half-credulous fascination as millions of others, filing away, without quite meaning to, the impression that this brand, and only this brand, delivered results so dramatic they bordered on the miraculous. The commercials themselves had, by this point, developed a highly refined internal structure, one that admen studied and taught with the seriousness of a science because, in their minds, it had become exactly that. The opening seconds existed almost entirely to capture attention, often through a small domestic crisis presented with theatrical urgency. A husband frowning at a wrinkled shirt, a child refusing to eat breakfast, a hostess glancing nervously at a stained tablecloth moments before guests arrive. These weren't random scenarios. They were carefully selected from research into the precise anxieties most commonly reported by housewives in surveys and focus groups, anxieties about social judgment, about failing to meet an invisible but keenly felt standard of domestic performance. The crisis established, the commercial would then introduce its product as the singular, almost magical solution, often within a suspiciously short span of time. The wrinkled shirt smoothed, the child suddenly delighted, the stain vanished before the doorbell even finished ringing. And finally, the commercial would close on a scene of restored harmony, a family reunited in contentment, a marriage subtly reaffirmed, all of it credited, explicitly or implicitly, to the product that had just been demonstrated. She has seen this exact structure so many times by now that she could likely predict, within the first 5 seconds of a new commercial, roughly how it would unfold, and yet the familiarity did nothing to diminish its effectiveness. If anything, the opposite was true. Familiarity bred a kind of comfort, a sense that this was simply how the world worked, how problems were solved, how happiness was achieved. One small purchase at a time. It is difficult, watching from the vantage point of decades later, to fully appreciate how thoroughly this rhythm, crisis, product, resolution, seeped into the collective imagination of an entire generation, shaping not just what they bought but how they understood the very nature of a problem and its solution, teaching, gently and repeatedly, that nearly any form of domestic unhappiness could be addressed not through communication, or patience, or simple acceptance of imperfection, but through the correct purchase, made promptly from the correct brand. One particular evening ritual deserves special attention here, because it represents perhaps the most ingenious fusion yet of advertising and social psychology developed during the decade. The home demonstration party, and no example of this form would become more culturally significant or more studied by business schools for decades afterward than the Tupperware Party. The product itself, a line of lightweight, airtight plastic containers, had actually struggled for years to find real commercial success when sold through ordinary retail channels. Displayed on a store shelf, without context or demonstration, the containers seemed unremarkable, their key innovation, an airtight seal achieved through a subtle design borrowed loosely from the lid of a paint can, invisible and unimpressive to a casual shopper simply glancing at a shelf. The breakthrough came not from a change to the product, but from a complete reimagining of how it would be sold. Rather than relying on department stores and retail clerks, The company built an entire sales force of women, recruited from the very suburban neighborhoods where the product would eventually be sold, trained not as traditional salespeople, but as hostesses of a kind of domestic social event. A woman would invite her friends and neighbors into her own living room for an afternoon or evening gathering, ostensibly social in nature, complete with coffee, light refreshments, and casual conversation, but structured around a carefully choreographed demonstration of the products themselves. This structure solved several problems at once, each of them rooted in a sophisticated, if largely unspoken, understanding of social psychology. First, the demonstration itself, showing the famous burp of air escaping a sealed container, or the dramatic reveal of a bowl held upside down without spilling its contents, was simply more persuasive performed live, in a familiar living room, by a friend or neighbor, than it could ever be through a printed advertisement or even a television commercial. Second, and more subtly, the presence of other women in the room created a social pressure that no solitary shopping trip could replicate. Purchases made in front of neighbors and friends became, in a small but real way, social performances of their own, statements about taste, thrift, and domestic competence witnessed and implicitly judged by the very community whose opinion mattered most. She sits on one such evening in a neighbor's crowded living room, a paper order form balanced on her knee, watching the hostess move through her demonstration with the practiced confidence of someone who has performed this exact routine dozens of times before. There are small games woven into the evening, guessing contests, prizes for correct answers, all designed not merely to entertain but to extend the length of the gathering, because research had shown that the longer a woman remained in this particular kind of social, product-focused environment, the more she was likely to purchase by the evening's end. The hostess herself earns a commission, or credit toward her own set of products, based on the total sales of the party, giving her a direct, personal incentive to encourage her guests toward larger and larger orders, an incentive she pursues not through aggressive salesmanship, but through the far gentler, far more effective tools of enthusiasm, friendship, and the subtle implication that a truly organized, truly modern household simply required this many containers, in this many sizes, for this many purposes. By the time she leaves that evening, arms loaded with a small tower of pastel plastic she had not planned to purchase, she does not feel as though she has been sold to in any conventional sense. She feels, instead, as though she has spent a pleasant evening among friends, one that happened to result in a few practical purchases for her kitchen. This is, perhaps, the single most important lesson the advertising industry of the 1950s ever learned and would carry forward into every subsequent decade of marketing. The most effective persuasion is the persuasion that never announces itself as persuasion at all, the sale that disguises itself as friendship, community, self-improvement, or simple common sense. Not every corner of the advertising world in the 1950s operated with such subtlety, however, and it is worth pausing to acknowledge the more overt, and at times more troubling, tactics that coexisted alongside these sophisticated psychological strategies. Health claims made by cigarette manufacturers during this decade, for instance, would seem almost unbelievable to modern audiences, with advertisements featuring men presented as doctors endorsing specific brands as gentler on the throat, or claiming a particular cigarette was the choice of more physicians than any other, claims made with the full confidence of scientific authority despite mounting private evidence, known within some corners of the industry itself, suggesting the exact opposite of what these advertisements implied. Weight loss products, tonics, and patent medicines of dubious value continued to circulate through magazines and radio spots with promises that would draw immediate legal scrutiny in later decades, but that, in the comparatively unregulated advertising landscape of the time, could be printed, broadcast, and repeated with only the faintest whisper of accountability. The Federal Trade Commission did exist during this period, and it did occasionally intervene, but its resources and its authority were limited compared to the sheer scale and sophistication of the industry it was meant to oversee. A misleading claim might eventually draw a formal complaint, a hearing, perhaps even an order to cease and desist. But by the time such action was taken, the advertisement in question might have already run its course for months or years, its message thoroughly absorbed into the public consciousness long before any correction, quiet and far less visible than the original claim, could hope to catch up. It is against this backdrop that the first genuine cracks in public trust toward advertising began, slowly and unevenly, to appear before the decade's end. A handful of journalists and social critics began publishing investigations into the more manipulative tactics being employed by the industry's motivational researchers, revealing to a wider public audience the extent to which their purchasing decisions had been studied, anticipated, and in some cases deliberately engineered by teams of psychologists working not on their behalf, but on behalf of the companies seeking their money. The revelations, when they reached ordinary households through magazine articles and eventually paperback books, produced a quiet but real unease, a sense among many housewives, including perhaps the very woman whose evening we have been following, that the friendly voice on the radio, the warm and trustworthy face on the television screen, had perhaps never been quite so friendly or so trustworthy as it had seemed. We'll pick up the story from here in the next part, exploring the mounting cultural anxiety around consumerism and conformity as the decade wore on, the particular pressures placed on children through advertising, the beginnings of consumer protection movements, and the slow, uneven dawn of skepticism that would eventually reshape the entire relationship between the American public and the advertisements that had, for the better part of 10 years, so thoroughly defined their daily lives. As the decade rolled forward, a strange and quietly uncomfortable tension began to settle over American suburban life, one that most people could feel but few could easily name. On the surface, everything gleamed. New cars sat in driveways with tail fins swept back like small rockets. New refrigerators hummed in every kitchen. New televisions flickered in every living room. And yet beneath this glittering surface of abundance, a quieter unease was taking root, a sense among many Americans, and particularly among many housewives, that they were being watched, studied, and quietly herded toward decisions that were never entirely their own. This unease would not fully surface into public consciousness until later in the decade, but its roots were already there, growing in the background of every jingle, every demonstration, every carefully staged television commercial. Consider, for a moment, the sheer scale of what had been built by the mid-1950s. Advertising expenditure in the United States had climbed to levels that would have seemed almost unimaginable just 20 years earlier, with billions of dollars flowing annually into radio spots, television commercials, magazine spreads, billboard campaigns, and an ever-expanding array of promotional gimmicks. This was not simply a larger version of the advertising that had existed before the war. It was a fundamentally different kind of enterprise, staffed increasingly not by simple salesmen with a gift for gab, but by psychologists, sociologists, statisticians, and researchers who approached the American consumer with the same rigor a laboratory scientist might apply to a study of animal behavior. She becomes aware of this in fragments through the pages of a magazine one afternoon, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee cooling beside her. The article, written by a journalist who had spent months investigating the inner workings of several major advertising agencies, describes in unsettling detail the depth of research being conducted into women exactly like her. Hidden cameras in test kitchens, recording not just what products a woman chose but the precise expression on her face as she picked up one box versus another. Focus groups conducted under the guise of casual coffee clutches, where trained researchers guided conversation toward specific products while women believed they were simply chatting with a friendly stranger about their daily lives. Depth interviews, borrowing techniques directly from psychoanalysis, designed to excavate buried anxieties and desires that a woman herself might not even be consciously aware of, and then feeding those insights directly into the next round of advertising campaigns. She sets the magazine down, unsettled in a way she cannot quite articulate. It isn't that any single revelation in the article strikes her as shocking on its own. It's the cumulative weight of it, the realization that behind every friendly jingle and every warm, reassuring announcer's voice, there existed an entire apparatus of observation and calculation, an industry that had, in effect, been studying women like her for years, cataloging their fears and their hopes, and then selling those very fears and hopes back to them, wrapped in colorful packaging and set to a catchy tune. This growing awareness did not arrive all at once, and it did not arrive uniformly across the country. For every housewife who read such an article with a flicker of unease, there were many more who remained entirely untroubled, who saw the growing sophistication of advertising not as manipulation, but simply as progress, the same kind of progress that had given them washing machines and frozen dinners and push-button conveniences their own mothers could scarcely have imagined. Advertising, after all, had woven itself so completely into the fabric of American entertainment and information that separating the two felt, to many, both unnecessary and slightly absurd. Why resent the very system that had also given them their favorite programs, their favorite songs, their favorite moments of shared cultural experience with neighbors and friends? And yet, slowly, a vocabulary of critique began to develop, first among academics and social critics, and gradually seeping into more mainstream conversation. Sociologists began writing about conformity, about the strange homogenization of American taste and desire that seemed to follow so closely behind the homogenization of American advertising. If every housewife across the country was being shown the same commercials, exposed to the same carefully researched appeals to status anxiety and domestic guilt, was it any surprise that suburban homes across wildly different regions of the country had begun to look and feel so remarkably similar to one another? The same brands of appliances, the same styles of furniture, the same shades of pastel tile and the same style of bathroom. A visitor traveling from a suburb outside Boston to one outside Denver might find the differences between the two neighborhoods far smaller than might be expected given the thousands of miles separating them. And more than one critic of the era pointed directly to the advertising industry as a primary architect of this quiet, sprawling sameness. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that begins to settle into her afternoons around this point in our story, though she would never describe it in quite these terms. It is the exhaustion of constant comparison, the low hum of anxiety that accompanies every trip to a neighbor's house, every glance at a magazine spread, every commercial break during her favorite afternoon program. Has she fallen behind? Is her home as modern, as efficient, as impressive as the homes she sees depicted so glowingly in every advertisement? The Joneses next door have just purchased a new set of patio furniture, advertised for weeks on the very same television station she watches every evening, and though she has never once thought seriously about entertaining guests on a patio, she finds herself, almost against her will, calculating whether her own outdoor space might benefit from a similar addition. This particular psychological mechanism, the manufacturing of desire through comparison rather than need, was, by the middle of the decade, one of the most well-understood and deliberately exploited tools in the advertiser's arsenal. Print advertisements began featuring not just a single glowing product, but entire aspirational scenes, tastefully appointed living rooms, elegant dinner parties, effortlessly composed family gatherings, each scene populated by actors whose entire function was to embody an idealized version of American domestic success that no real family could ever quite match, because it had never actually existed in the first place, constructed instead from studio lighting, professional styling, and the careful selection of props designed to convey wealth and taste without appearing overtly extravagant. The genius and the cruelty of this particular strategy lay in its subtlety. A woman looking at such an advertisement was rarely told, in any explicit sense, that her own home was inadequate. She was simply shown an alternative, presented so casually, so naturally, that the comparison seemed to occur entirely within her own mind, a private, personal realization rather than an external judgment imposed upon her. This made the resulting anxiety far more difficult to resist or even to recognize, because it never felt like an attack. It felt like her own quiet observation, her own conclusion, reached independently, that perhaps her curtains were a touch too dated, her dinnerware a touch too plain, her kitchen a touch too far behind the gleaming, effortless modernity being celebrated everywhere she looked. Children, too, were becoming an increasingly sophisticated target of this same machinery, and by the later years of the decade, the ethical questions surrounding advertising directed at young audiences had begun to draw the attention of parents, educators, and eventually lawmakers. Saturday morning television, once a relatively modest slice of programming squeezed in around adult content, had exploded into a dedicated, carefully cultivated block of children's entertainment, populated by cartoons whose characters bore a suspicious resemblance to the mascots plastered across cereal boxes, toy packaging, and snack wrappers throughout the supermarket. The line between entertainment and advertisement, already blurred for adult programming, all but disappeared entirely in the world of children's television, where a half-hour of cartoon adventures might be interrupted 8 or 10 times by commercials for products directly tied to the very characters children had just been watching. Her own children, sprawled on the living room floor on a Saturday morning, absorbed this programming with the complete, unguarded attention that only children seem capable of offering, an attention advertisers understood and exploited with a precision that would later draw considerable criticism. Children, researchers had discovered, lacked the cognitive tools necessary to distinguish clearly between the entertainment portion of a broadcast and the commercial portion, particularly when both featured the same beloved characters, the same bright colors, the same energetic packing. A cartoon tiger who spent 5 minutes having an adventure might in the very next segment appear again, this time encouraging young viewers directly to ask their mothers for a specific box of cereal, and to a child of 5 or 6, there was often no meaningful distinction between these two appearances at all. The tiger was simply the tiger, trusted, beloved, and crucially believed. This exploitation of childhood credulity did not go entirely unnoticed or unchallenged even within the decade itself. A small but growing number of parent organizations, educators, and concerned citizens began raising early objections to the practice, arguing that children, unable to critically evaluate commercial claims the way adults at least theoretically could, deserved some measure of protection from an advertising apparatus that showed little restraint in exploiting their trust and their nagging power over parental purchasing decisions. These early objections would not result in any significant regulatory action during the 1950s itself. That reckoning would take considerably longer to arrive, but they represent an important early thread in a much longer story about the ethics of marketing to children, a conversation that continues, in various forms to this day. Meanwhile, a parallel and equally important shift was occurring within the advertising industry itself, one driven not by external criticism, but by internal competition and the relentless pursuit of ever more effective techniques. As more and more companies embraced the psychological, research-driven approach to advertising, a kind of arms race developed, with agencies competing not just to sell more product, but to develop ever more sophisticated methods of understanding and influencing consumer behavior. Subliminal advertising, the controversial and largely discredited notion that images or messages could be flashed on screen too quickly for conscious perception while still somehow influencing behavior, became a subject of intense public fascination and anxiety during this period, fueled by sensational claims, later found to be largely fabricated or at least grossly exaggerated. That a single movie theater experiment had dramatically boosted concession sales by flashing hidden messages urging viewers to buy popcorn and soda. Though the specific claims behind this particular story would eventually be debunked, the public fascination and fear it generated reveals something important about the cultural mood of the era. Americans had begun to suspect, correctly in broad terms even if the specific mechanisms were often misunderstood or exaggerated, that the advertising industry possessed tools and techniques operating beneath the threshold of conscious awareness, techniques capable of shaping behavior without the target ever realizing she had been influenced at all. This suspicion, once planted, proved remarkably durable, and echoes of it can still be found in advertising folklore and public discourse many decades later, long after the original subliminal messaging panic had faded from memory. She herself, sitting in her living room one evening as the television flickers through its usual parade of programming and commercials, finds herself thinking about this newly acquired knowledge in a way she hadn't before. She watches the screen not with the same unguarded absorption she once brought to it, but with something closer to a wary, curious skepticism, noticing for the first time the careful staging of a commercial kitchen scene, the suspiciously perfect lighting, the actress's rehearsed smile arriving at exactly the moment the product is revealed. This is not disillusionment exactly, not yet a wholesale rejection of the advertising world that surrounds her, but it is the beginning of something, a small crack of critical awareness opening within a mind that had, for years, absorbed these messages largely without question. This slow, uneven awakening would continue to develop throughout the remainder of the decade and into the next, eventually contributing to a broader consumer rights movement that would, by the 1960s, produce meaningful regulatory reform, stronger truth in advertising standards, and a more skeptical, more critically engaged American public. But in 1956, this future remains distant and uncertain. For now, the jingles continue to play. The commercials continue to promise transformation, happiness, and social acceptance in exchange for the correct purchase. And millions of American housewives continue to move through their days accompanied by a near-constant soundtrack of persuasion, absorbing it, resisting it in small and scattered ways, and more often than not, simply living within it, because it had, by this point, become so completely woven into the fabric of daily life that imagining an alternative required an act of significant, and still relatively rare, critical effort. Let's turn now to a slightly different thread of this story, one that takes us away from the individual household and toward the broader machinery of the advertising industry itself. The agencies, the executives, the culture of Madison Avenue that produced this endless stream of persuasion, and the particular pressures and contradictions faced by the very people responsible for crafting these messages, many of whom harbored private doubts about the industry they had built even as they continued, day after day, to perfect its most effective techniques. The advertising agencies of the 1950s were, in many ways, a world unto themselves, concentrated heavily along a single stretch of Manhattan Avenue that had, by this point, become synonymous with the entire industry. Madison Avenue was not simply a location. It was a shorthand, a cultural symbol representing a particular kind of ambitious, image-conscious, deeply competitive professional world, populated almost entirely by men in gray flannel suits who moved between agencies with the same restless, opportunistic energy that characterized much of post-war American business culture. Within these agencies, creative teams worked under enormous pressure to produce campaigns that could capture and hold the attention of an increasingly sophisticated, increasingly advertisement-saturated public, all while satisfying the often contradictory demands of clients who wanted campaigns that were simultaneously bold and safe, innovative and instantly familiar, memorable and utterly inoffensive. The internal culture of these agencies has been described, by those who lived through it, as a strange blend of creative freedom and ruthless commercial pressure. Copywriters and art directors were given, in some respects, remarkable latitude to experiment with new visual styles, new narrative structures, new emotional appeals, precisely because the competitive landscape demanded constant innovation simply to maintain the public's ever more difficult to capture attention. And yet this creative freedom existed within a framework of intense accountability, with campaigns judged almost entirely by their measurable impact on sales figures, a metric that left little room for artistic ambition that failed to translate into increased revenue for the client. Many of the men, and it was overwhelmingly men in the most senior creative and executive roles, who built the advertising campaigns that shaped an entire decade of American consumer culture, held complicated, sometimes openly conflicted feelings about the work they produced. Internal agency memos and later personal accounts from figures within the industry reveal a surprising degree of self-awareness about the manipulative nature of their craft. Discussions among colleagues about the ethics of exploiting maternal guilt to sell a particular brand of baby food, or debates about how far a health claim could be stretched before it crossed from persuasive exaggeration into outright deception. These were not, for the most part, men who believed themselves to be villains. Many genuinely believed they were providing a valuable service, helping American families navigate an overwhelming marketplace of new products by highlighting genuine benefits and building trusted, reliable brand relationships. But the internal tension between this self-image and the increasingly manipulative techniques being developed and deployed by the industry's own researchers created a quiet, largely unspoken discomfort that would occasionally surface in memoirs, interviews, and internal industry publications throughout the decade and beyond. We'll continue this exploration in the next part, moving into the specific stories behind some of the era's most iconic and most controversial advertising campaigns, the rise of brand mascots and their surprisingly deliberate psychological design, the particular strategies used to sell products related to health, beauty, and the body, and the growing role of advertising in shaping not just what Americans bought, but how they understood their own identities, their own aspirations, and their own place within the rapidly changing landscape of post-war American life. Let's talk now about the mascots, those strange, cheerful, endlessly patient cartoon figures who smiled down from cereal boxes, detergent labels, and magazine advertisements throughout the decade, because their design was far less accidental than most people ever realized. The creation of a successful brand mascot in the 1950s was treated with the same seriousness an agency might apply to casting the lead role in a major film production, and for good reason. A well-designed mascot could accomplish something that no amount of straightforward product description ever could. It could create genuine, lasting emotional attachment, a sense of familiarity and even affection that transcended the actual qualities of the product itself. Consider the deceptively simple task facing the artists and psychologists tasked with designing these characters. The mascot needed to be instantly recognizable, reproducible in a single color if necessary for cheaper print runs, appealing to children without being so juvenile that adults found it embarrassing to have in their kitchen, and above all, trustworthy, radiating the kind of warmth and reliability that a stranger's face on a television screen could rarely achieve in just 30 seconds. Early sketches for many of the decade's most enduring mascots went through dozens, sometimes hundreds of revisions, with focus groups testing subtle variations in eye shape, smile width, and even the precise tilt of a cartoon head, because research had shown that these microscopic details measurably affected how much a viewer trusted, liked, and ultimately associated warm feelings with the character in question. There was, additionally, a fascinating and largely unspoken psychological principle at work in the deployment of these mascots, one rooted in what researchers of the era were beginning to understand about authority and trust. A cartoon doctor, chef, or scientist, rendered friendly and approachable through simplified, rounded features, could lend an aura of expertise and credibility to a product's claims without any of the legal or ethical complications of hearing an actual doctor, chef, or scientist to make those same claims. If a smiling cartoon dentist appeared on a toothpaste box, nodding approvingly at the product's cavity-fighting claims, many consumers processed this image with a small but real transfer of authority and trust, even though, on a conscious level, they understood perfectly well that this dentist was not real, had never examined a single tooth, and existed purely as a marketing device. She notices this, one afternoon, while reading the back of a cereal box at the breakfast table, waiting for her children to finish getting dressed for school. The mascot on the box, a grinning, energetic cartoon figure she has seen so many times she could likely sketch it from memory, is depicted flexing an improbably muscular arm beside a claim about the cereal's supposed strength-building properties. She has never once questioned this particular claim, has simply absorbed it over years of repeated exposure, the same way she absorbed the tune of the product's accompanying jingle without ever deciding to memorize it. This is, perhaps, one of the quieter but more profound legacies of 1950s advertising's use of mascots. The creation of brand loyalty that operated almost entirely below the threshold of rational evaluation, rooted not in any genuine assessment of product quality, but in years of accumulated, low-level emotional familiarity, cultivated deliberately and methodically by teams of artists and psychologists working in offices she would never see, for a company whose actual manufacturing process she would never fully understand. The beauty and health advertising of the decade deserves its own careful attention here, because it operated according to a slightly different, and in some ways even more psychologically aggressive, set of principles than the advertising aimed at household products. Where a detergent commercial might promise cleaner clothes, a beauty product advertisement often promised something far more existential: the restoration or preservation of a woman's fundamental value as a person, tied inextricably, according to the advertisements themselves, to her physical appearance, and by extension, her ability to remain desirable to her husband and impressive to her peers. The language used in these advertisements, when examined closely, reveals a consistent and deliberate strategy built around manufactured anxiety, followed immediately by manufactured relief. A skincare advertisement might open with a stark, almost clinical description of the visible signs of aging, fine lines, dullness, a loss of what the copywriters invariably called radiance or glow, presented not as a natural and inevitable part of human life, but as a kind of failure, a problem requiring immediate correction. The solution, of course, arrived within the very same advertisement, packaged in an elegant bottle and often endorsed by a fictional or occasionally real dermatologist, promising a restoration of youth so complete and so rapid that a careful reader might reasonably wonder why anyone would ever age at all, if the solution were truly as simple and as widely available as the advertisement suggested. She stands before her bathroom mirror one evening, working through the now familiar ritual of her nightly skincare routine, a sequence of creams and lotions accumulated gradually over years of exposure to exactly this kind of advertising. Each product in her small arsenal had arrived in her life through a similar pathway, a magazine advertisement promising a specific, named benefit, a testimonial from a satisfied customer whose photograph had likely never actually used the product before the photograph was taken, a claim of scientific backing that rarely specified exactly what that science consisted of or where it had been conducted. She applies each product with a kind of quiet, hopeful faith, not because she has any specific evidence that any individual product works as promised, but because the cumulative weight of years of advertising exposure has taught her that this is simply what a responsible, self-respecting woman does each evening, regardless of whether the promised results ever fully materialize. This particular category of advertising, more than perhaps any other produced during the decade, has drawn sustained criticism and analysis in the decades since, precisely because of the depth and persistence of the anxieties it both exploited and actively cultivated. Critics writing later in the 20th century would point to 1950s beauty advertising as a significant contributor to a broader cultural pattern in which women's worth was persistently and systematically tied to narrow, difficult-to-achieve standards of physical appearance, standards that shifted subtly but continuously from year to year, ensuring that no woman, regardless of how diligently she followed the advice and purchased the products advertised to her, could ever quite reach a stable, permanent sense of having arrived at acceptable beauty. The goalposts, by design, never stopped moving, because a woman who felt fully satisfied with her appearance was, from the perspective of an industry built on continuous consumption, a woman who had stopped buying, and stopping was simply not something the system could tolerate. Parallel to this, and often overlapping with it, ran an entire category of advertising focused specifically on weight and body size, an area of 1950s marketing that reveals, with particular clarity, how thoroughly the industry had learned to weaponize insecurity in service of sales. Diet products, exercise gadgets of dubious effectiveness, and appetite suppressants of sometimes genuinely dangerous composition were marketed aggressively throughout the decade, often accompanied by advertisements depicting a stark, deliberately unflattering before image contrasted against a glowing, triumphant after image. The visual language borrowed almost directly from religious narratives of transformation and redemption, repurposed entirely in service of selling a girdle, a tonic, or a mechanical vibrating belt claimed to melt away unwanted inches through the simple application of movement and friction. The regulatory environment surrounding these claims, as we discussed earlier regarding the broader advertising industry, remained remarkably permissive by later standards, allowing manufacturers extraordinary latitude in describing the supposed benefits of their products. A vibrating exercise belt might be advertised with confident claims about spot reduction of fat, a concept that later, more rigorous scientific understanding of human physiology would demonstrate to be essentially impossible. And yet in 1956, such claims could be printed in national magazines and broadcast on national television with only the faintest whisper of scientific pushback, if any pushback occurred at all. We should pause here and consider, too, the particular role that testimonial advertising played throughout this entire landscape, because it represents one of the era's most psychologically effective and most ethically questionable techniques. A testimonial, presented as the genuine, unsolicited praise of a satisfied customer, carried an entirely different kind of persuasive weight than a direct claim made by the manufacturer itself. Consumers, then as now, tended to trust the word of a peer, a supposedly ordinary person with no financial stake in the product's success, far more readily than they trusted the word of the company selling that product. Advertising agencies understood this principle deeply, and testimonial advertising exploded throughout the decade as a result, appearing across nearly every product category, from cigarettes endorsed by supposedly real doctors, to beauty products praised by women identified only by first name and hometown, to household appliances endorsed by minor celebrities, whose actual, private opinions of the products in question were rarely, if ever, disclosed to the public. The authenticity of these testimonials varied enormously, and not always in the direction consumers might have hoped. Some were genuine, reflecting the real, if perhaps enthusiastically compensated, opinions of actual customers or celebrities who had genuinely used and enjoyed the products in question. Others, however, were constructed almost entirely from whole cloth, written by copywriters in agency offices, attributed to fictional or composite consumers whose photographs had been selected from stock image libraries or hired models, presented to the public with a confidence and specificity, complete with named towns and invented personal details, designed to obscure the fact that the entire testimonial had never actually occurred in any real form. This practice, when it was eventually exposed in various investigative articles throughout the decade and beyond, contributed significantly to the growing public skepticism toward advertising that we touched on earlier, part of a slow but steady erosion of the assumption that what appeared in a national magazine or on a trusted television program could simply be taken at face value. There is a particularly striking example from this period involving a series of advertisements built around supposed testimonials from real doctors endorsing specific cigarette brands, campaigns that ran with remarkable confidence throughout much of the decade, featuring men in white coats, stethoscopes draped meaningfully around their necks, offering reassurance about the relative gentleness of one brand's tobacco blend compared to competitors. These advertisements exploited, with considerable success, the deep cultural authority Americans of the era extended to medical professionals, an authority the advertising industry understood intimately and deployed strategically across dozens of product categories entirely unrelated to actual health care. The specific and devastating irony of the cigarette doctor campaigns promoting a product whose genuine, catastrophic health risks were already beginning to accumulate in scientific literature, even as these advertisements ran, would not become fully and publicly apparent until years later. But their existence throughout the 1950s represents one of the starkest and most consequential examples of the advertising industry's willingness to deploy manufactured authority and trust in service of sales, regardless of the underlying truth of the claims being made. She herself, sitting once more in her living room as evening settles over the neighborhood, watches her husband light a cigarette after dinner, a brand chosen years earlier based partly on just such an advertisement, and thinks nothing of it, because there is, at this point in the story, still very little reason within the broader culture to think otherwise. The warm, authoritative voice of the advertisement, the reassuring image of the white-coated doctor, the confident claims about mildness and quality, all of it exists within a media and cultural environment that has not yet developed the tools, the regulatory frameworks, or the collective skepticism necessary to seriously challenge such claims. This, too, is part of the story we are telling tonight, not simply a catalog of clever marketing techniques, but a portrait of an entire society still learning, often through painful and sometimes tragic experience, the necessary skills of critical evaluation that would eventually become second nature to later generations raised amid greater consumer awareness and stronger regulatory protection. Let's shift our attention now to the automobile, perhaps the single most emotionally significant purchase most 1950s American families would make, and an entire universe of advertising built around it, one that reveals, with particular vividness, how thoroughly the industry had learned to sell not objects but identities, aspirations, and entire visions of the American future. The automobile industry of the 1950s existed in a state of near-constant reinvention, driven by a business philosophy, pioneered decades earlier, but perfected during this period, built around planned obsolescence, the deliberate strategy of introducing meaningful or purely cosmetic changes to vehicle design on an annual basis, ensuring that a car purchased just a year or two earlier would begin to look, at least by comparison to the newest models, somewhat dated, somewhat behind the times, regardless of how mechanically sound it remained. This strategy required an advertising apparatus of extraordinary sophistication and constant output, one capable of convincing consumers, year after year, that this year's model represented a genuinely meaningful leap forward, worthy of trading in a perfectly functional vehicle for something newer, sleeker, and more thoroughly aligned with the aesthetic and cultural values of the moment. The advertisements themselves, appearing in glossy magazine spreads and increasingly elaborate television commercials, rarely focused on the practical mechanics of the vehicles being sold. Fuel efficiency, reliability, and safety, qualities that might seem, to a modern audience, like the most logical and important features to highlight when selling an automobile, received comparatively little attention throughout much of the decade. Instead, the advertisements sold speed as a feeling rather than a measurable statistic, luxury as a visual and sensory experience rather than a list of features, and status as the primary, unspoken benefit lurking behind every advertisement's glossy imagery of a confident family gliding down an open highway in their gleaming new vehicle. The tail fins swept back like something borrowed from the era's fascination with jet aircraft and rocket ships, evoking not simply transportation, but an entire narrative of progress, ambition, and forward momentum that resonated deeply with a national culture still basking in the confident afterglow of post-war economic expansion. He, her husband, sitting in his chair with the newspaper one evening, pauses on an automobile advertisement occupying a full page, studying the sweeping lines of the newest model with an attention and interest he rarely brings to any other section of the publication. This particular advertisement, like nearly every automobile advertisement of the era, features not simply the vehicle itself, but an entire aspirational scene built carefully around it. A confident, well-dressed man behind the wheel, a beautiful, admiring wife in the passenger seat, well-behaved children in the back, all of them gliding through a landscape that suggests freedom, prosperity, and the successful, effortless achievement of the American dream in its most idealized, consumer-driven form. He does not need this particular car, and on some rational level he likely knows this. His current vehicle, purchased only a few years earlier, remains entirely functional. But the advertisement is not, and was never intended to be, an appeal to rational necessity. It is an appeal to a deeper, more persistent desire, one the advertising industry had, by this point in the decade, become extraordinarily skilled at identifying, cultivating, and monetizing. The desire to be seen, by neighbors, by colleagues, by one's own family, as a man who was keeping pace with the accelerating promise of American post-war prosperity. We'll continue this story in the next part, examining the particular anxieties and pressures faced by American men during this same period. The advertising built specifically to address masculine identity and status, the growing suburban culture of competitive consumption, sometimes referred to as keeping up with the Joneses, and the beginning of the cracks that would eventually widen into the broader cultural and political critiques of consumerism that would come to define the following decade. The American man of the 1950s occupied a peculiar and often contradictory position within the broader advertising landscape, one worth examining closely, because the pressures placed upon him, while different in texture from those placed upon his wife, were in many ways just as relentless, just as carefully engineered, and just as revealing of the underlying machinery of post-war consumer culture. Where advertising aimed at housewives leaned heavily on domestic guilt, social judgment, and the fear of failing to meet an invisible standard of household perfection, advertising aimed at men leaned instead on a different but equally potent set of anxieties. The fear of professional stagnation, the fear of being perceived as less successful than one's neighbors and colleagues, and perhaps most powerfully, the fear of a kind of quiet, encroaching irrelevance, the sense that a man who failed to keep pace with the newest products, the newest gadgets, the newest models of everything from automobiles to lawn mowers, risked being left behind by a culture that equated forward momentum with personal worth. He returns home each evening from an office job that, for many men of his generation, involved long hours of anonymous, often unfulfilling labor within increasingly large and impersonal corporate structures. the kind of work that sociologists of the era had already begun describing, with a mixture of concern and fascination, as fundamentally different from the more visible, more tangible labor of earlier generations. His own father, perhaps, had built things with his hands, worked a farm, run a small shop where the results of his daily effort were immediately visible and measurable. He, by contrast, spends his days shuffling paperwork, attending meetings, navigating the subtle and often exhausting social politics of a large organization, producing work whose ultimate value and impact often remain frustratingly abstract, filtered through layers of management before ever translating into anything he could point to with confidence and say, simply, "I built this." Advertising aimed at this particular anxiety proved remarkably effective throughout the decade, offering men a kind of compensatory identity built not around professional achievement, which remained frustratingly intangible for so many, but around consumption itself, around the visible, tangible markers of success that could be purchased, displayed, and immediately recognized by neighbors and colleagues alike. The automobile we discussed earlier represented perhaps the most obvious and most successful example of this strategy, but it extended across an enormous range of product categories throughout the decade. Power tools marketed not simply for their practical utility, but for the masculine identity they conferred upon their owner, the implicit suggestion that a man who owned the newest, most powerful drill or table saw was somehow more capable, more competent, more fully realized as a man. Regardless of whether he ever actually used these tools for any meaningful purpose beyond their display in a well-organized garage. Lawn care, too, emerged during this decade as an entirely new category of masculine consumer anxiety, one that would have seemed almost incomprehensible to earlier generations of Americans, for whom a lawn, if it existed at all, served primarily practical rather than aesthetic or competitive purposes. The post-war suburban explosion, with its neat rows of nearly identical homes set back from the street by small, carefully maintained patches of grass, created an entirely new social arena in which a man's diligence, taste, and implicit financial success could be measured and judged by his neighbors through something as seemingly trivial as the height, color, and uniformity of his lawn. Advertisements for lawn mowers, fertilizers, and increasingly elaborate sprinkler systems tapped directly into this new social pressure, promising not simply a well-maintained yard, but a kind of quiet, unspoken victory in the ongoing, never quite acknowledged competition playing out across every suburban block in America. He stands in his own backyard one Saturday afternoon, freshly purchased power mower rumbling beneath him, and glances instinctively toward his neighbor's yard, comparing, almost against his will, the evenness of the grass, the crispness of the edges along the walkway, the overall impression of effortless, prosperous order that both men have spent considerable time and money attempting to project to a neighborhood audience that, in truth, likely pays far less attention to any individual lawn than either man assumes. This particular psychological dynamic, competitive consumption, driven not by genuine need or even genuine desire, but by a kind of anxious, comparative awareness of one's neighbors, would eventually earn its own enduring cultural shorthand, a phrase borrowed from an earlier comic strip, but fully cemented into the American vocabulary during precisely this decade. Keeping up with the Joneses, a phrase that captured with remarkable economy the entire psychological architecture that 1950s advertising had spent a decade carefully constructing and reinforcing. It is worth pausing here to consider just how thoroughly this dynamic had been engineered, rather than simply emerging organically from human nature. Certainly, some degree of social comparison and status anxiety has likely existed throughout human history, in every culture and every era. But the specific, intensified, product-focused version of this anxiety that flourished throughout 1950s suburban America was, in significant part, a deliberate creation of an advertising industry that had discovered, through years of careful research, that comparative anxiety, the fear of falling behind one's peers, represented one of the single most reliable and renewable engines of consistent consumer spending. A man perfectly satisfied with his current lawn mower, his current automobile, his current suit, was, from the perspective of an industry built on continuous growth, a problem to be solved. And the solution, again and again throughout the decade, involved carefully calibrated advertisements designed to introduce or intensify precisely the kind of comparative dissatisfaction that would drive him back into the marketplace. The social clubs, neighborhood associations, and informal gathering spaces that characterized suburban life throughout this period served, whether by design or simple coincidence, as effective amplifiers for exactly this kind of comparative consumption anxiety. A backyard barbecue, a neighborhood block party, a casual conversation over the fence while trimming hedges, all of these ordinary social interactions became, in a culture increasingly saturated by advertising's emphasis on visible product-based status markers, opportunities for quiet, unspoken evaluation and comparison. Did the neighbors mention, with just a hint of envy, the new patio furniture? Did they notice the latest model automobile in the driveway? These small social exchanges, seemingly trivial in isolation, accumulated over months and years into a powerful, self-reinforcing culture of competitive consumption that required no explicit advertisement to sustain itself, having become, by this point in the decade, simply an accepted and largely unquestioned feature of suburban social life. Let's turn our attention now to a particular category of household technology that deserves careful examination, both for its genuine practical impact on daily domestic labor and for the fascinating, often contradictory ways it was marketed throughout the decade. The wave of new kitchen and household appliances that transformed, or at least promised to transform, the daily experience of housework for millions of American women. The washing machine, the dishwasher, the electric mixer, the food processor in its earliest, clumsiest form, each of these represented genuine technological advances over the more laborious, more time-consuming methods of household labor that had characterized earlier generations. And yet the advertising built around these genuine advances often promised something considerably more ambitious than mere convenience. The promise, made explicitly and repeatedly throughout countless advertisements, of liberation itself, the suggestion that these new machines would finally free the American housewife from the burden of domestic labor, granting her hours of newfound leisure to pursue her own interests, relax, and enjoy a quality of life her own mother could scarcely have imagined. This promise, appealing and optimistic as it sounded, rarely materialized in the straightforward way the advertisement suggested, and this particular gap between promise and reality would eventually become one of the central preoccupations of social critics examining the decade's consumer culture. Sociological research conducted both during and after the decade revealed a curious and somewhat counterintuitive pattern. Despite the proliferation of labor-saving devices throughout the American home, the total number of hours American housewives spent on domestic labor each week remained, on average, remarkably consistent throughout the decade, showing little of the dramatic reduction the advertisements had so confidently promised. The explanation for this apparent paradox, when researchers eventually untangled it, revealed something important about the true function of these appliances within the broader culture of the era. Rather than simply reducing the total volume of domestic labor, the new appliances tended instead to raise the overall standard of what constituted acceptable domestic performance. A washing machine didn't simply save time on the laundry a housewife had already been doing. It made possible, and increasingly expected, a level of laundry frequency and cleanliness that would have been physically impossible under the older methods of hand washing and wringing. Clothes that might once have been worn for several days before washing were now expected to be laundered after a single use. A dishwasher didn't simply eliminate the time spent washing dishes by hand. It enabled, and soon demanded, more elaborate meal preparation, more dishes and serving pieces used for each meal, more frequent entertaining, all of which generated new categories of domestic labor to fill the time ostensibly saved by the machine itself. She experiences this dynamic directly, though without the vocabulary or the broader sociological context to fully name what she is experiencing. Her new dishwasher, purchased with real excitement after months of advertisements promising newfound free time, has indeed made the specific task of washing dishes considerably faster and less physically demanding than it once was. And yet her overall sense of the time available to her each day feels, if anything, more constrained than ever, filled instead with an ever-expanding list of other domestic responsibilities, more elaborate meal planning to justify the investment in her new appliances, more time spent maintaining an increasingly high standard of household cleanliness and organization that the advertisements themselves had helped establish as the new, expected baseline, more time spent researching and evaluating the next generation of products promising to solve whatever problems remained. This particular pattern would eventually attract the attention of some of the era's most influential social critics, whose work, published toward the very end of the decade and into the beginning of the next, would help crystallize a growing public unease into a more coherent and widely shared critique of American consumer culture. One particularly influential book, published in the final years of the decade, drew directly on the same motivational research techniques we discussed earlier, techniques the advertising industry itself had developed and refined, and turned them back critically upon the industry, exposing to a broad popular readership the depth and sophistication of the psychological manipulation underlying so much of the advertising Americans encountered in their daily lives. The book's success, and the considerable public conversation it generated, marked an important turning point, one of the first moments in which the manipulative techniques of the advertising industry became widely, explicitly discussed and understood not just among academics and industry insiders, but among ordinary American consumers themselves. Around this same period, though its full cultural impact would not arrive until several years into the following decade, a small but growing number of women began privately, and eventually publicly, questioning the entire premise upon which so much of the era's advertising and broader cultural expectation had been built. The assumption that domestic labor, however elaborate, however thoroughly optimized by the newest appliances and the newest products, represented the natural, complete, and fully satisfying life's work for American women. Interviews and surveys conducted during the later years of the decade, though not yet widely publicized, began revealing an undercurrent of quiet dissatisfaction among many suburban housewives, a vague but persistent sense that something essential was missing from lives that, by every external, advertisement-reinforced measure, should have represented the pinnacle of achievable happiness and success. She feels this too, in fleeting, hard-to-articulate moments scattered throughout her days, a strange hollowness that arrives sometimes in the middle of an otherwise ordinary afternoon, folding laundry or wiping down a kitchen counter already gleaming from her efforts an hour earlier. She would not, if asked directly, describe herself as unhappy. Her life, by the standards constantly reinforced around her, through magazine advertisements, television commercials, and the quiet social comparisons of her neighborhood, represents genuine success. A comfortable home, a steadily employed husband, healthy children, a kitchen full of the latest labor-saving appliances. And yet the feeling persists, quiet and largely unexamined, a sense that the endless cycle of consumption and domestic optimization promised by every advertisement she encounters has not, in fact, delivered the complete and lasting satisfaction it so confidently guaranteed. This particular thread of quiet, largely unspoken dissatisfaction, present in various forms throughout many American households during the final years of the decade, would not fully surface into broad public and political consciousness until the beginning of the following decade, when a landmark work of nonfiction, drawing extensively on surveys and interviews conducted with women exactly like her, would give this vague, difficult to articulate feeling a name and a broader social and political context, helping to catalyze what would eventually become a significant and transformative social movement. But in 1956, this future remains distant, unformed, and largely unimaginable to the woman experiencing its earliest, quietest tremors. For now, the advertisements continue, the appliances continue to arrive, each one promising, with the same confident optimism as the one before it, the genuine liberation and satisfaction that had, so far, remained frustratingly, persistently just out of reach. Let's shift our focus now toward the specific and fascinating history of food advertising during this decade, an area of the industry that saw perhaps the most dramatic technological and cultural transformation of the entire era, driven by genuine advances in food science and preservation technology, but shaped, marketed, and ultimately consumed through exactly the same psychological principles we have been exploring throughout tonight's story. The years following the war saw an extraordinary acceleration in American food processing technology, driven in significant part by advances originally developed for military purposes during the conflict itself. Technologies for preservation, packaging, and rapid preparation that had been designed to feed soldiers efficiently in the field, and were now being adapted, repurposed, and marketed for civilian kitchens across the country. The frozen dinner, perhaps the single most emblematic food product of the entire decade, emerged directly from this technological lineage, and its marketing history offers a particularly rich case study in how the advertising industry approached the challenge of selling genuinely novel products to a consumer base that had, until quite recently, possessed no prior framework for understanding or evaluating them. The earliest frozen dinners faced a significant marketing challenge that had little to do with taste or nutrition, and everything to do with deeply held cultural assumptions about the role and meaning of home-cooked food within the American family structure. A meal prepared by a housewife's own hands carried, within the broader cultural framework of the era, significant symbolic weight, representing care, devotion, and the fulfillment of a woman's most essential domestic responsibility. A frozen, factory-produced meal, however convenient, risked being perceived not simply as a practical alternative, but as a kind of quiet failure, a visible admission that a housewife had chosen convenience over the genuine expression of love and care that home cooking supposedly represented. The advertising campaigns built around these early frozen dinner products approached this challenge with considerable psychological sophistication, carefully framing the products not as a replacement for genuine home cooking, but as a practical solution for specific, narrowly defined circumstances that would not threaten a housewife's broader identity and self-image. A busy evening before an important social engagement, an emergency meal option for unexpected guests, a special treat reserved for evenings when the family wanted to enjoy a novel, almost futuristic dining experience together, gathered around the television, eating from individually portioned trays designed explicitly for consumption in front of the very screen that had likely introduced the product to the household in the first place. She purchases her first frozen dinner with a small, private sense of guilt she cannot quite explain, tucking the box into her grocery cart between more conventional purchases, as though it required a kind of visual camouflage. And yet that evening, watching her family eat their individually portioned meals in front of the television, an entirely new kind of domestic ritual that would, within just a few years, become thoroughly normalized across millions of American households. She finds herself surprised by how readily her family embraces the novelty, how little judgment or disappointment actually materializes from what she had anticipated might be a small domestic failure. This small, private experience, repeated across countless households throughout the decade, represents the slow, incremental process through which genuinely novel products gradually shed their initial cultural stigma, aided at every step by advertising campaigns carefully designed to manage and eventually dissolve exactly the kind of guilt and hesitation she experienced during that first tentative purchase. We'll continue our exploration in the next part of tonight's story, moving deeper into the specific advertising strategies built around convenience food more broadly, the fascinating and sometimes troubling marketing of products specifically to children within the grocery store environment itself, the rise of the modern supermarket as a carefully engineered retail environment, and the broader questions of nutrition, health claims, and regulatory oversight that would eventually reshape the entire relationship between the American food industry and the consumers it served. The modern supermarket, as an institution, came fully into its own during precisely this decade, and its physical design deserves careful attention here, because it represents one of the most successful and enduring fusions of retail strategy and psychological manipulation developed during the entire era. A fusion so effective that its basic principles would continue to govern grocery store design for the remainder of the 20th century and well beyond. Earlier generations of American grocery shopping had typically involved a clerk retrieving items on behalf of a customer, who would specify exactly what she needed from a counter or list, a system that offered the retailer relatively little opportunity to influence purchasing decisions beyond the customer's own predetermined intentions. The self-service supermarket model, which expanded rapidly throughout the 1950s, inverted this relationship entirely, placing the customer directly among the products themselves, wandering aisle after aisle, and in doing so created an entirely new retail environment ripe for exactly the kind of careful psychological engineering that the broader advertising industry had already perfected across other media. Every element of the supermarket's physical layout, by the middle of the decade, had become the subject of careful research and deliberate design. Essential items, the products a shopper would almost certainly need regardless of any external persuasion, milk, bread, eggs, were typically positioned at the furthest corners of the store, requiring a customer to traverse the maximum possible distance, and therefore pass the maximum possible number of tempting, non-essential displays, before reaching the items on her original shopping list. Products with the highest profit margins for the retailer were positioned at eye level, the height most naturally and effortlessly scanned by an adult shopper's gaze, while less profitable but often more affordable store brands were relegated to higher or lower shelves, requiring a more deliberate, conscious effort to locate. The placement of products specifically marketed to children received its own particularly deliberate and, in retrospect, ethically fraught attention. Researchers studying supermarket design during this period discovered that products positioned at a child's eye level, considerably lower than the eye level calibrated for adult shoppers, generated significantly higher rates of the very kind of pestering and nagging behavior we discussed earlier, the small, persistent requests that so often wore down a parent's resolve by the time the shopping cart reached the checkout counter. Sugary cereals, candy, and heavily branded snack products, festooned with the same beloved cartoon mascots children encountered every Saturday morning on television, were deliberately positioned at exactly this height, transforming the cereal aisle in particular into a carefully calibrated battlefield where a child's outstretched hand, guided by weeks of televised advertising exposure, could reach a box of sugar-frosted cereal with far greater ease than the plainer, less heavily marketed alternatives positioned above. She navigates this environment weekly, her children trailing alongside her cart, and experiences firsthand the particular exhaustion that so many parents of the era, and indeed of every subsequent era, would come to recognize. The low-grade, repeated negotiation occurring at every turn of every aisle, a negotiation she had not consciously agreed to, but had nonetheless been drawn into by a retail environment designed with exactly this dynamic in mind. She finds herself, more often than she would like to admit, simply capitulating, adding a box of heavily sweetened cereal to her cart, not because she believes it represents good nutrition, but because the alternative, a prolonged, public negotiation with a tired, insistent child in a crowded supermarket aisle, feels considerably less appealing than the small concession itself. The checkout counter, meanwhile, had by this point in the decade evolved into its own carefully studied psychological environment, the final and in some ways most concentrated opportunity for impulse purchasing before a transaction concluded. Candy, gum, and small, inexpensive novelty items were positioned within easy reach of a child seated in a shopping cart, precisely at the height and location most likely to prompt a last-minute request, timed deliberately to occur during the brief, distracted window, while a parent focused on unloading groceries and completing payment, a moment when resistance to a small child's request often felt like more trouble than it was worth for the sake of a single candy bar. It is worth pausing to consider, too, the particular claims made throughout this decade regarding the nutritional value of many of the processed and packaged foods flooding onto supermarket shelves. Claims that, examined with the benefit of later scientific understanding, ranged from genuinely accurate to wildly overstated too. In some documented cases, essentially fabricated. The regulatory framework governing nutritional claims throughout the 1950s remained considerably less rigorous than what would eventually develop in later decades, allowing manufacturers substantial latitude in how they describe the health benefits of their products. A product might be marketed as fortified or enriched, terms that carried genuine scientific meaning in some cases, referring to the deliberate addition of vitamins and minerals during processing, but that were also, in many instances, deployed more as marketing language than as a precise, verifiable description of meaningful nutritional content. The broader cultural context surrounding nutrition during this decade also deserves attention, because it reveals a fascinating and somewhat contradictory set of values that advertisers navigated with considerable skill throughout the period. On one hand, the era's advertising consistently celebrated scientific progress and modernity, framing processed, factory-produced foods as inherently superior to the older, more labor-intensive methods of home food preservation and preparation that earlier generations had relied upon. Canning, freezing, and chemical preservation were presented not as compromises, but as triumphant achievements of American industrial ingenuity, evidence of a nation moving confidently forward into an abundant, convenient future. On the other hand, this same advertising often simultaneously invoked older, more traditional values, nostalgic imagery of homemade goodness, grandmother's recipes, and old-fashioned flavor, even when describing products that had, in reality, been developed in industrial laboratories and manufactured through processes bearing little resemblance to any traditional home kitchen. This particular tension, between celebrating modern industrial progress and simultaneously invoking traditional, nostalgic authenticity, appears throughout countless advertisements from the decade, and reveals something important about the sophisticated understanding advertisers had developed regarding the complicated, sometimes contradictory emotional needs of their audience. American consumers of the 1950s wanted, it seemed, both things simultaneously: the genuine convenience and abundance that modern industrial food production offered, and the emotional comfort and authenticity associated with older, more traditional methods of food preparation that this same industrial production had, in significant part, actually displaced. Advertisers responded to this tension not by resolving it, but by simply offering both narratives at once, whichever proved more persuasive for a given product in a given context, regardless of whether the two narratives could be logically reconciled with one another. Let's turn now toward a slightly different aspect of the era's advertising landscape, one we touched on briefly earlier, but that deserves considerably more detailed attention. The mail-order catalog, a retail format with roots reaching back decades before the 1950s, but that experienced its own particular renaissance and refinement during this period, developing increasingly sophisticated techniques for reaching and persuading customers who lived beyond the immediate reach of urban department stores and downtown shopping districts. The mail-order catalog occupied a unique and psychologically interesting position within the broader landscape of 1950s consumer culture, arriving not through the immediate, momentary persuasion of a television commercial or a supermarket display, but through the mail, into the private space of the home, where it could be examined, studied, and returned to repeatedly over an extended period of time, sometimes for days or weeks before any purchase decision was finally made. This extended engagement offered catalog publishers an opportunity that more fleeting advertising formats could not easily replicate: the chance to construct an entire aspirational world across hundreds of pages, presenting not just individual products but a comprehensive vision of the ideal American home, family, and lifestyle, one carefully curated page after carefully curated page. She spends a quiet evening occasionally paging through one such catalog, spread open across her lap on the living room sofa, moving slowly through section after section. Clothing modeled by smiling, impeccably composed families, furniture arranged in warm, inviting room settings, appliances photographed with the same careful studio lighting techniques we discussed earlier regarding magazine and television advertising. The sheer scale and comprehensiveness of these catalogs, often running to many hundreds of pages, created a distinctive psychological experience quite different from a single magazine advertisement or television commercial. Rather than encountering one persuasive appeal at a time, she encounters an entire, internally consistent universe of aspiration, page after page reinforcing the same underlying vision of what a successful, modern, well-appointed American household should look like. A vision that, through sheer cumulative repetition across hundreds of pages, began to feel less like a sales pitch and more like an accurate, almost objective description of how life ought to be lived. The catalog format also enabled a particular kind of careful, deliberate product presentation that print advertising and television commercials, constrained by space and time, could not easily match. A single item, a particular dress or piece of furniture, might be presented not simply through a single photograph, but through multiple images showing different angles, different color options, sometimes even different family members using or wearing the product in slightly different contexts, allowing a potential customer to imagine, in considerable and carefully guided detail, exactly how this particular purchase might integrate into her own family's daily life. This level of detailed, extended engagement, combined with the private, unhurried nature of catalog browsing, made the format particularly effective for larger, more considered purchases: furniture, appliances, and clothing for special occasions, categories of spending that benefited from exactly the kind of extended, cumulative persuasion that a 200-page catalog could provide far more effectively than a 30-second television commercial. The order forms themselves, tucked into the back pages of these catalogs, had been designed with their own careful psychological considerations. Filling out an order form, selecting items, checking boxes for size and color, calculating a total, engaged a customer in an active, participatory process quite different from the more passive experience of watching a television commercial or reading a magazine advertisement. This active engagement, researchers of the era had discovered, tended to increase the likelihood of a completed purchase. because the customer had already invested meaningful time and cognitive effort into the selection process. By the time she reached the final step of actually writing a check or arranging payment, creating exactly the kind of psychological momentum, similar in principle to the foot-in-the-door technique we discussed regarding door-to-door salesmen, that made abandoning the purchase at this late stage feel like a wasted effort rather than a simple, easy decision. Let's turn our attention now to a particular and somewhat darker corner of the decade's advertising landscape, one that reveals, perhaps more starkly than any other example we have discussed tonight, the genuine human costs that could accompany an advertising industry operating with relatively little regulatory oversight and an increasingly sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation. The marketing of patent medicines, tonics, and dubious health remedies that continued to circulate widely throughout American media during this decade, often targeting precisely the anxieties and vulnerabilities of consumers dealing with genuine, sometimes serious health concerns. While the most flagrant and dangerous patent medicine scandals of earlier American history, the wildly exaggerated cure-all tonics of the 19th and early 20th centuries, had been curtailed to some degree by earlier waves of regulatory reform, the 1950s nonetheless saw the continued circulation of numerous products making health claims that ranged from significantly overstated to genuinely dangerous. Marketed through the same sophisticated psychological techniques being refined throughout the broader advertising industry. Weight loss products containing substances that would later be identified as genuinely hazardous to human health, tonics claiming to cure a remarkably broad and often vague array of ailments, and vitamin supplements marketed with claims of preventing or curing conditions well beyond what any legitimate scientific evidence could support, all continued to find substantial markets throughout the decade. Aided by advertising that had grown increasingly skilled at exploiting genuine anxiety about health and appearance, while providing only the thinnest, most easily challenged veneer of scientific credibility. She encounters advertisements for exactly these kinds of products regularly throughout her week, tucked into the pages of the same magazines that carry the more conventional advertisements for detergent and cereal we have discussed at length tonight, promising relief from fatigue, from nervous tension, from the vague but persistently marketed condition. Contemporary advertisements referred to simply as rundown feeling, a catch-all diagnosis flexible enough to apply to almost any American experiencing the ordinary exhaustion of daily domestic labor, and conveniently treatable, according to the advertisements themselves, through the regular consumption of a particular tonic or vitamin supplement whose actual physiological benefits, when later subjected to more rigorous scientific scrutiny, often proved considerably more modest than the confident, authoritative language of the advertisements had suggested. This particular category of advertising deserves special attention within our broader story tonight, because it illustrates, with unusual clarity, the fundamental ethical tension that ran throughout the entire advertising industry of the decade, a tension between legitimate, honest promotion of genuinely useful products and services, and the more troubling exploitation of consumer vulnerability, anxiety, and limited access to reliable, independent information. The industry as a whole, and indeed individual practitioners within it, occupied positions along this entire spectrum, from advertisers genuinely committed to honest, accurate product description, to those willing to stretch claims considerably beyond what evidence could support, to those operating with what can only be described, in retrospect, as a fairly casual disregard for the genuine physical safety and well-being of the consumers they targeted. We'll continue this exploration in the next part of tonight's story, moving toward the growing regulatory and consumer protection movements that would eventually begin addressing some of these more troubling practices. The fascinating history of the first significant truth in advertising legal cases of the era, the broader cultural shift towards skepticism and critical media literacy that would slowly develop throughout the remainder of the decade and into the next, And finally, a closer examination of how this entire era of advertising history would come to shape, in ways both obvious and subtle, the marketing techniques and consumer culture of every subsequent generation of Americans, including, in many respects, our own. The regulatory landscape governing American advertising throughout the 1950s existed in a peculiar and often frustrating state of institutional lag, with the government agencies theoretically responsible for consumer protection struggling, throughout the decade, to keep pace with an industry that had grown vastly more sophisticated, vastly better funded, and vastly more psychologically informed than the regulatory framework originally designed to oversee it. The Federal Trade Commission, established decades earlier with a mandate to prevent unfair and deceptive business practices, found itself, by the middle of the 20th century, attempting to apply relatively broad, general legal standards to an advertising landscape that had become extraordinarily specific, technical, and in many cases, deliberately designed to operate within the gray areas the existing regulatory language had never anticipated. A formal complaint against a misleading advertisement, once filed, typically triggered a lengthy administrative process, involving investigation, hearings, and often extended legal appeals, a process that could easily consume a year or more before any final resolution was reached. By the time a particular advertising campaign was formally found to be deceptive and ordered to cease, the campaign in question had often already run its full intended course, its message thoroughly absorbed by millions of consumers, its impact on sales and brand perception already fully realized, long before any regulatory correction, considerably less visible and considerably less memorable than the original advertisement, could hope to reach the same audience with anything approaching equivalent effectiveness. This structural lag between deceptive advertising and regulatory correction represented one of the more significant, if less dramatically visible, failures of consumer protection throughout the decade, allowing considerable harm to accumulate before any meaningful institutional response could be mounted. Several notable legal cases throughout the decade did nonetheless begin establishing important precedents that would eventually strengthen the regulatory framework governing advertising claims, even if their immediate practical impact remained limited. Cases involving demonstrably false claims about product performance, cases involving fabricated or misleadingly staged product demonstrations, similar to the shaving cream controversy we discussed earlier, and cases involving explicitly false testimonials attributed to individuals who had never actually used or endorsed the products in question, gradually accumulated throughout the decade into a body of legal precedent that later regulators and legislators would draw upon when constructing the more robust consumer protection framework that would emerge more fully in subsequent decades. Consumer advocacy organizations, still relatively modest in scale and political influence compared to what they would become in later decades, nonetheless began important early work throughout this period, conducting independent product testing, publishing comparative reviews, and gradually building public awareness of the gap that often existed between advertising claims and genuine product performance. These organizations, operating with considerably more limited resources than the advertising industry they sought to scrutinize, nonetheless represented an important early counterweight, providing at least some independent, evidence-based information to consumers who had, throughout most of the decade, possessed remarkably few reliable sources for evaluating the flood of competing claims and counterclaims flowing from every direction of American media. She herself becomes aware of this slowly emerging landscape of consumer advocacy toward the latter portion of our story, encountering, perhaps through a magazine article or a brief mention on the evening news, references to organizations conducting independent testing of products she has purchased based largely on advertising claims alone. This awareness, when it arrives, produces in her a complicated mixture of relief and unease, relief that some independent check on the advertising industry's claims exists at all, unease at the growing realization of just how thoroughly she has, for years, been navigating her household purchasing decisions based almost entirely on information provided directly by the very companies seeking to profit from those decisions, with little independent verification of the claims she had, for so long, simply accepted at face value. This growing, if still gradual and incomplete, culture of consumer skepticism did not emerge in isolation but developed alongside, and was significantly reinforced by a broader wave of critical scholarship and journalism examining the advertising industry throughout the final years of the decade. We touched earlier on the influential book that drew directly on motivational research techniques to expose the psychological manipulation underlying much of contemporary advertising. And this work, alongside several other significant journalistic and academic examinations of the industry published during roughly the same period, collectively contributed to a meaningful, if gradual, shift in how educated American consumers understood and related to the advertisements surrounding them throughout their daily lives. These critical works shared several common themes worth examining closely, because they represent the emerging vocabulary and conceptual framework through which Americans would increasingly come to understand and critique consumer culture throughout the remainder of the 20th century. First, and perhaps most fundamentally, these critiques emphasize the deliberate, calculated nature of advertising psychological techniques, pushing back forcefully against the industry's own preferred self-presentation as a straightforward, honest provider of useful product information, and instead revealing, through detailed investigation, and in some cases, direct access to internal industry research and strategy documents, the extent to which advertising had become a sophisticated applied science of persuasion, drawing directly on psychology, sociology, and even elements of psychoanalysis to identify and exploit specific, predictable patterns of human vulnerability and desire. Second, these critiques increasingly connected the specific manipulative techniques of individual advertisements to broader concerns about the health and character of American society and culture as a whole. Critics argued that a culture increasingly organized around the cultivation and satisfaction of manufactured desires, rather than the fulfillment of genuine human needs, risked producing citizens who were, in important respects, less autonomous, less capable of independent critical judgment, and more thoroughly shaped by external commercial forces than the ideals of American democratic citizenship, at least in their more idealistic formulations, would seem to require or even tolerate. This connection between consumer manipulation and broader concerns about democratic citizenship and personal autonomy would prove particularly influential in shaping the intellectual and political context within which the more robust consumer protection movements of the following decades would eventually develop. Third, and perhaps most immediately relevant to the specific story we have been telling tonight, several of these critical works paid particular attention to the specific ways in which advertising's manipulative techniques disproportionately targeted and exploited women, and American housewives in particular, drawing direct connections between the advertising industry's careful cultivation of domestic anxiety and social comparison, and the broader, still largely unarticulated dissatisfaction that many suburban women, including, as we discussed earlier, the very woman whose day we have been following throughout tonight's story, had begun to quietly experience but had not yet found adequate language or social context to fully understand or express. Let's pause here, near the end of our exploration tonight, to step back and consider the broader historical significance of the advertising landscape we have spent these many hours examining together. The 1950s represent, in many important respects, a genuine turning point in the history of American consumer culture, a decade during which advertising evolved from a relatively straightforward, if occasionally exaggerated, practice of product promotion into something considerably more sophisticated, more psychologically informed, and more thoroughly integrated into the fundamental fabric of American daily life than anything that had existed in previous eras. The techniques developed and refined throughout this decade, the careful psychological research into consumer motivation, the sophisticated use of testimonials and demonstrated authority, the deliberate cultivation of social comparison and status anxiety, the seamless integration of commercial messaging into entertainment programming, the careful engineering of retail environments to maximize impulse purchasing, would not simply fade away as the decade concluded. Instead, these techniques would continue to develop and refine themselves throughout the subsequent decades of American consumer culture, adapting to new media technologies, new demographic targets, and new psychological research, but retaining, at their core, many of the same fundamental principles first developed and tested throughout the households, supermarkets, and living rooms of 1950s suburban America. Consider, for a moment, how many of the specific techniques we have discussed throughout tonight's story remain immediately recognizable in the advertising landscape of our own contemporary moment, adapted, certainly, to new technologies and new media formats, but built upon fundamentally similar psychological principles. The careful cultivation of social comparison anxiety, once achieved through magazine spreads depicting idealized suburban living rooms, now operates through carefully curated social media feeds depicting idealized vacations, idealized homes, and idealized lifestyles, generating precisely the same kind of quiet, comparative dissatisfaction that 1950s advertisers so carefully engineered through entirely different media technologies. The exploitation of parasocial trust and intimacy, once achieved through the warm, familiar voices of radio and television announcers who had cultivated years of audience trust, now operates through social media influencers and content creators who occupy remarkably similar psychological positions within their own audience's daily lives, offering the same kind of manufactured intimacy and trust that can be, and often is, deployed in service of commercial persuasion. The marketing of products specifically to children, once achieved through cartoon mascots and carefully timed Saturday morning television programming, continues today through entirely new digital platforms and formats, raising many of the same ethical questions about childhood credulity and parental authority that concerned critics throughout the latter years of the 1950s. And the fundamental psychological insight that first drove much of the era's advertising innovation, the recognition that human purchasing decisions are driven far more by emotion, identity, and unconscious desire than by straightforward, rational evaluation of a product's practical utility, remains, to this day, the foundational assumption underlying nearly every significant advertising campaign produced by any major company operating in any contemporary market. She herself, of course, has no awareness of this longer historical arc extending decades beyond her own particular moment in 1956. She experiences the advertising landscape of her own decade not as a historical case study, but as the simple, immediate texture of her daily life, the jingles that accompany her morning coffee, the commercials that interrupt her favorite afternoon programs, the carefully staged department store windows that catch her eye during her occasional shopping excursions downtown. And yet, in the quiet, largely unspoken unease that has occasionally surfaced throughout the story we have told together tonight, in her growing, if still incomplete, awareness of the careful psychological engineering underlying so much of what she encounters throughout her days, we can perhaps glimpse the earliest stirrings of a longer, ongoing cultural conversation about consumer manipulation, autonomy, and the ethics of persuasion that would continue to develop, in various forms and various contexts, throughout the remainder of the 20th century and well into our own contemporary moment. Let's use the remaining time we have together tonight to slow down considerably, moving away from the broader historical and cultural analysis that has occupied much of our story so far, and returning instead to the quieter, more intimate rhythms of an ordinary 1950s evening, allowing ourselves to simply rest within this particular moment in American history, without further analysis or critique, and simply experience, one final time, the particular atmosphere and texture of the world we have spent this evening exploring together. The sun has fully set now over her quiet suburban street, and the houses along the block glow softly with the warm, flickering light of televisions playing behind drawn curtains, each household absorbed in its own particular evening ritual, its own particular relationship with the advertisements and programming flowing continuously through the airwaves into homes across the entire country. She moves through her own kitchen one final time before bed, rinsing the last of the evening's dishes, wiping down the counter with the same careful, practiced motions she has performed thousands of times before, guided by habits and standards cultivated, in no small part, by years of accumulated advertising exposure she has, by this point in her life, largely stopped consciously noticing at all. Her husband sits in the living room, newspaper folded on his lap, half watching the television's final programming of the evening, the last commercials of the day playing out their familiar, well-worn rhythms of crisis, product, and resolution one more time before the broadcast day concludes, and the television screen fades to static and silence. Her children sleep upstairs, dreaming, perhaps, of cartoon mascots and Saturday morning cereal, their young minds already thoroughly steeped in a media and commercial environment that their own parents' generation had never experienced during their own childhoods. A generation growing up entirely within the world that the advertising industry of the 1950s had so carefully and deliberately constructed. She climbs the stairs finally, tired in the particular, cumulative way that comes not from any single dramatic event, but from the steady accumulation of countless small decisions, small comparisons, small moments of aspiration and mild anxiety scattered throughout an ordinary day, lived within an extraordinarily persuasive commercial environment. She settles into bed, the house finally quiet around her, and allows her mind at last to drift towards sleep, carrying with her, whether she fully recognizes it or not, the accumulated residue of dozens of jingles, hundreds of images, and countless small, carefully engineered suggestions about who she should be, what she should want, and what kind of life genuine happiness and success would ultimately require her to purchase. Thank you for spending these hours with me tonight, exploring the strange, fascinating, and often quietly unsettling world of 1950s American advertising. If you found yourself drifting off somewhere along the way, that's exactly as it should be. Rest well, and I'll see you next time, in another quiet corner of history. If you're still here with me, still drifting somewhere between waking and sleep, let's continue a little further into this world, because there remain several more corners of 1950s advertising worth exploring together tonight. Corners that reveal, in their own particular ways, just how completely this decade's marketing apparatus wove itself into nearly every major milestone and season of American life. Let's begin with the wedding, perhaps the single most heavily marketed personal milestone of the entire decade, an event that had, by the 1950s, become the target of an entire specialized industry built around convincing young American women that a truly successful, truly meaningful wedding required an ever-expanding list of specific products, services, and traditions, many of which had only recently been invented or popularized by the very companies now presenting them as timeless, essential customs. Consider the diamond engagement ring, an object whose cultural centrality to American courtship rituals feels, to many people even today, like an ancient, unquestionable tradition. In reality, the aggressive marketing campaign that established the diamond ring as an essential, expected element of nearly every American engagement had only truly taken hold in the years immediately preceding and during this decade, the product of one of the most successful and enduring advertising campaigns in the entire history of the industry. A single, now famous three-word slogan, crafted by a young copywriter working late one evening, had managed to accomplish something extraordinary, transforming a luxury commodity, previously purchased by only a modest fraction of engaged couples, into what felt, within the space of little more than a decade, like an absolute, non-negotiable prerequisite for a legitimate, socially respectable engagement. The campaign's genius lay in its careful, sustained cultivation of an idea rather than a simple, direct sales pitch. Advertisements rarely mentioned price or even explicitly instructed readers to purchase a ring. Instead, they told stories, placed strategically within popular magazines and eventually motion pictures, stories in which diamonds appeared as the quiet, unmistakable symbol of enduring, serious love, contrasted implicitly against lesser, presumably less committed relationships that lacked this particular token. Wealthy, glamorous celebrities were quietly encouraged, sometimes through direct arrangement with the campaign's sponsors, to be photographed wearing larger and more elaborate diamond rings, creating an aspirational visual standard that filtered down through magazine coverage into the imagination of ordinary young women across the country. Women who had never previously considered a diamond ring an essential requirement, but who now found themselves measuring their own engagements, consciously or not, against this newly established, thoroughly manufactured standard. She recalls, faintly, her own engagement some years earlier, and the quiet, unspoken assumption, one she had never really examined at the time, that a proper proposal required a ring of a certain minimum size and quality, an assumption she had absorbed so completely and so gradually that it had felt, by the time her own engagement occurred, less like a marketing message and more like simple, self-evident common sense, a good indication of exactly how thoroughly successful this particular campaign, and so many others like it throughout the decade, had become at transforming manufactured commercial expectation into what felt like natural, unquestionable social reality. The wedding itself, once the ring had been secured, opened up an entire additional universe of marketing opportunity, one that bridal magazines of the era pursued with tremendous enthusiasm and considerable commercial success. The white wedding dress, the multi-tiered cake, the elaborate reception with its carefully choreographed sequence of toasts, dances, and traditions, many of these specific elements, presented within bridal magazines and advertisements as essential, time-honored customs, had in fact been relatively recent innovations, popularized and standardized in no small part through decades of careful, deliberate marketing by department stores, caterers, and photography studios eager to establish an ever more elaborate, ever more expensive template for what a proper American wedding required. Life insurance, too, deserves mention here as a particularly interesting category of advertising throughout the decade, one built around an entirely different emotional register than most of what we have discussed tonight, an appeal not to aspiration or status, but to a deeper, more somber anxiety about mortality, family security, and the responsibility a husband and father bore for his family's continued well-being even after his own eventual death. Advertisements for life insurance policies throughout the decade often employed a strikingly direct, even stark visual and narrative language, depicting a grieving widow and children left financially vulnerable, a scenario presented not as an unlikely, distant possibility, but as an ever-present risk requiring immediate, responsible action in the form of a properly sized policy purchased from precisely this company and no other. He encounters such an advertisement one evening, tucked into the pages of a magazine he has been reading, and feels the particular, uncomfortable weight of its central appeal settle over him for a long moment. The advertisement does not exaggerate wildly or make claims that strain credibility the way some of the other advertisements we have discussed tonight might. It simply presents a scenario, quietly and soberly, that touches directly on one of his own genuine, private anxieties, the responsibility he feels for his family's continued security, and suggests, with a confidence he finds himself inclined to trust, that this particular anxiety can be substantially addressed through the purchase of an appropriately sized policy. This particular advertising strategy, built around genuine rather than manufactured anxiety, represents an interesting variation on the broader psychological principles we have explored throughout tonight's story, illustrating that even where the underlying human concern was entirely legitimate and reasonable, the advertising industry had nonetheless developed sophisticated techniques for shaping exactly how, when, and through which specific company that legitimate concern would ultimately be addressed. Let's turn now to the particular rhythms of the American holiday season as experienced through the advertising landscape of this decade. Because the commercialization of major holidays, a phenomenon often assumed by casual observers to be a distinctly contemporary development, had already reached a remarkably sophisticated and comprehensive form by the middle of the 1950s, built upon marketing techniques and traditions that had, in several important cases, been substantially shaped or even directly invented by advertising campaigns of the preceding decades. Christmas, unsurprisingly, represented the single largest and most heavily marketed commercial event of the entire American calendar, and the specific visual iconography most Americans today associate with the holiday, the jolly, red-suited figure of Santa Claus, had been substantially standardized and popularized through decades of advertising campaigns, most famously a long-running series of advertisements for a major soft drink company that had, throughout the preceding decades, commissioned illustrations depicting this now iconic version of the character, an image that had gradually displaced earlier, considerably more varied depictions of the holiday figure across American popular culture. The department stores of the era transformed their entire physical spaces during the weeks preceding Christmas into elaborate, immersive marketing environments, complete with towering, theatrically decorated trees, live actors portraying Santa Claus prepared to greet an endless line of hopeful children, and window displays of extraordinary artistic ambition, each one designed to draw families downtown specifically to experience the spectacle, an experience carefully calibrated to conclude, naturally and almost inevitably, with the family moving from the free spectacle of the window displays directly into the store itself to complete their actual holiday shopping. She takes her own children downtown one December afternoon to view precisely this kind of elaborate holiday window display, watching their faces light with genuine, unguarded delight at the intricate mechanical figures and twinkling lights arranged behind the glass, and feels in that moment a complicated mixture of genuine warmth and a quieter, more analytical awareness, cultivated by everything we have discussed together throughout tonight's story, of exactly how deliberately and skillfully this particular experience of childhood wonder had been engineered by a team of professional window dressers and marketing strategists, employed specifically to produce exactly this reaction in exactly this way, in service of the department store's broader holiday sales targets. The gift-giving traditions of the holiday itself had also been substantially shaped by decades of accumulated advertising influence, with entire product categories, most notably an ever-expanding array of children's toys, having grown dramatically in both scale and cultural significance throughout the post-war years, driven in significant part by the same kind of Saturday morning television advertising we discussed earlier regarding children's cereal marketing. The specific toys that would become the most sought-after, most desperately requested gifts of any given holiday season were rarely simply the products that children happened to independently discover and desire. They were, far more often, the products that had received the most sustained, most strategically placed advertising throughout the preceding months, an entire industry of toy manufacturers and their advertising partners working in careful coordination to ensure that by the time December arrived, the season's designated must-have toy had already been thoroughly, repeatedly impressed upon the imagination of children across the entire country. Let's turn briefly, toward the beginning of the American school year, another significant seasonal milestone that had, by the middle of the decade, developed its own substantial and increasingly sophisticated advertising apparatus, built around the particular anxieties parents experienced regarding their children's academic and social success. Anxieties that back-to-school advertising campaigns proved remarkably adept at identifying and addressing through an ever-expanding array of school supplies, clothing, and accessories. She takes her children shopping each August for the coming school year, guided by lists and advertisements suggesting, with considerable confidence, exactly which specific products would best position her children for academic success and social acceptance among their peers. The particular brand and style of book satchel a child carried, the specific type of pencil case, the particular cut and color of clothing deemed appropriately fashionable for the coming school year. Each of these seemingly minor decisions had, by this point in the decade, become the subject of extensive market research and carefully targeted advertising, all of it built around the underlying anxiety, familiar to parents across every subsequent generation as well. That a child's social standing and confidence among peers could be measurably influenced by whether their school supplies and clothing matched the current, advertising-driven standard of acceptability. Let's now bring our exploration back toward its final, quieter stretch, moving through the remaining hours of this particular story with the same slow, unhurried pace we have maintained throughout tonight's journey, allowing ourselves to simply rest within the accumulated texture of everything we have explored together across this long, detailed portrait of 1950s American advertising and consumer culture. Let's turn our attention now to a subject we have touched upon only briefly so far, but that deserves considerably more careful examination: the specific role that celebrity endorsement played throughout the decade's advertising landscape, and the particular, often surprising ways that fame, trust, and commercial persuasion intertwined throughout this period of American media history. Celebrity endorsement was, of course, not a novel invention of the 1950s. Prominent public figures had lent their names and faces to commercial products for decades before this particular era began. But the scale, sophistication, and sheer pervasiveness of celebrity-driven advertising expanded dramatically throughout this decade, driven in significant part by the parallel expansion of television itself, which created an entirely new category of celebrity, the television personality, whose face and voice became familiar to millions of American households on a near-daily basis, generating exactly the kind of parasocial trust and intimacy that advertisers had already learned, through years of radio experience, to exploit with considerable commercial effectiveness. Film stars, too, found themselves increasingly courted by advertising agencies eager to attach their glamour and cultural cachet to a widening array of consumer products, arrangements that studios, still operating under the considerable contractual control they exercised over many of their contracted performers during this era, often negotiated directly, sometimes with only limited input or enthusiasm from the actors themselves, who found their carefully cultivated public images increasingly deployed in service of commercial interests only tangentially related to their actual creative work. A leading actress's face might appear in advertisements for cosmetics, appliances, or clothing lines entirely unrelated to any film she had actually appeared in, her fame itself functioning as the actual product being sold, transferred through careful visual and narrative association onto whatever commercial product happened to be paying for the arrangement in any given month. The specific psychological mechanism underlying celebrity endorsement, then as now, relied heavily on a principle researchers would later formally describe as the halo effect, the tendency for positive associations in one domain, an actress's beauty, a sports figure's athletic accomplishment. A television host's warm, trustworthy on-screen persona to transfer, largely unconsciously, onto an entirely unrelated domain. In this case, the perceived quality and desirability of whatever product that celebrity happened to be endorsing. A viewer watching her favorite film actress praise a particular brand of cold cream had, in a meaningful psychological sense, very little actual evidence regarding the cream's genuine effectiveness. What she possessed instead was a powerful, well-established positive feeling toward the actress herself, a feeling advertisers had learned to redirect, through careful visual and narrative construction, toward the product being endorsed, creating a form of borrowed credibility that required no genuine expertise or even genuine personal use of the product on the part of the celebrity in question. She herself finds this particular technique among the most difficult to fully resist, even armed with the growing critical awareness we have discussed developing within her throughout the course of tonight's story. A cosmetics advertisement featuring a beloved film actress, one she has watched and admired across numerous pictures over the years, carries an emotional weight and persuasive force that a similar advertisement featuring an anonymous model simply cannot replicate, regardless of how thoroughly she has come to understand, on an intellectual level, the manufactured, strategic nature of celebrity endorsement as a commercial technique. This gap between intellectual understanding and emotional susceptibility represents one of the more persistent and challenging aspects of resisting sophisticated advertising manipulation, a gap that would continue to characterize the relationship between advertising and its audiences for decades beyond the particular moment we have been exploring throughout tonight's story. Sports figures, too, became increasingly prominent endorsers throughout this decade, their commercial appeal built around a somewhat different but equally powerful psychological foundation: the association between athletic achievement, physical vitality, and the specific products these figures agreed to endorse. A prominent baseball player photographed enjoying a particular breakfast cereal implicitly suggested, without ever making the claim directly or explicitly, that this same cereal might contribute to the kind of physical strength and athletic success the player himself had achieved, an implicit, unstated causal connection that careful advertising language and visual composition worked hard to suggest without ever crossing into the kind of explicit, factually verifiable claim that might attract genuine regulatory scrutiny. Let's shift our attention now toward a topic that runs throughout nearly every category of advertising we have discussed tonight, but that deserves its own dedicated examination: the specific and carefully studied use of color, sound, and sensory design throughout the decade's advertising output, techniques that operated at a level considerably more fundamental and more difficult to consciously resist than the narrative and psychological strategies we have primarily focused on throughout most of tonight's story. Color theory, as applied specifically to advertising and product packaging, had developed into a genuinely sophisticated field of applied research by the middle of the decade, drawing on psychological studies examining how specific colors reliably triggered particular emotional associations and physiological responses across broad populations of consumers. Red, researchers had discovered through extensive testing, reliably triggered feelings of urgency, appetite, and excitement, explaining its prevalence across food packaging and sale signage throughout the era. Blue, by contrast, reliably triggered feelings of trust, cleanliness, and calm, explaining its heavy use across advertising for cleaning products, medical and health-related items, and financial services, including the life insurance advertisements we discussed earlier. Yellow triggered feelings of warmth, optimism, and energy, explaining its prevalence across breakfast food packaging, specifically designed to evoke the cheerful, energetic start to the day that advertisers wanted consumers to associate with their particular brand. These principles, once established through research, were applied with remarkable consistency and precision throughout package design, print advertising, and eventually television commercials throughout the remainder of the decade, creating a visual environment in which consumers were, quite literally, surrounded by carefully calibrated color choices designed to trigger specific emotional responses at a level well beneath conscious awareness or deliberate evaluation. She moves through her own kitchen, her own bathroom, her own pantry, surrounded by products whose packaging colors have been selected not through any random aesthetic preference on the part of the manufacturer, but through careful, deliberate research into exactly which shade of red, blue, or yellow would most effectively trigger the desired emotional and physiological response in someone exactly like her, standing exactly where she now stands, considering exactly the kind of purchase she is now considering. Sound, too, received similarly careful attention throughout the decade, particularly as radio advertising matured and television advertising began incorporating its own increasingly sophisticated approach to musical composition and sound design. The jingle, that particularly persistent and memorable form of advertising music we have referenced repeatedly throughout tonight's story, represented the culmination of years of research into exactly what musical structures, rhythms, and melodic patterns proved most effective at achieving what advertising professionals of the era referred to, with a mixture of pride and slight unease, as stickiness, the tendency for a particular tune to lodge itself in a listener's memory and resurface, seemingly involuntarily, at moments entirely disconnected from any deliberate act of recall. Musicologists and composers working specifically within the advertising industry throughout this decade developed increasingly sophisticated theories regarding exactly which musical elements produced this particular effect most reliably. Simple, repetitive melodic structures, rhythms closely aligned with natural human heart rate and walking pace, lyrics constructed around simple, easily repeated phrases rather than complex or varied language, and overall song lengths kept deliberately short, typically well under 30 seconds, ensuring that the entire musical phrase could be easily absorbed and retained even by a listener only partially attending to the broadcast in question. These principles, refined throughout the decade through extensive testing and revision, would go on to influence not just subsequent decades of advertising jingles but broader popular music composition itself, as the same underlying psychological principles governing memorable, catchy musical construction proved applicable well beyond the specific context of commercial advertising. She finds herself, on more than one occasion throughout the course of her ordinary day, humming a jingle she has heard perhaps only a handful of times, the melody surfacing unbidden while she works through some unrelated household task, a small but telling demonstration of exactly how effectively this particular musical technology had been refined and deployed throughout her own decade, embedding itself into her mind with a persistence and involuntary quality that few other forms of information or communication throughout her daily life could hope to replicate. This particular phenomenon, the involuntary, persistent recall of advertising jingles long after their initial broadcast, would eventually receive its own dedicated area of psychological research in subsequent decades, examining the specific cognitive mechanisms that made certain musical patterns so uniquely resistant to conscious forgetting, research that traces its origins, in significant part, directly back to the careful, deliberate experimentation conducted by advertising composers throughout precisely the decade we have spent tonight's story exploring together. Let's move now toward a slightly different but closely related subject, one we have gestured toward throughout tonight's story, but that deserves a more focused, dedicated examination: the specific and carefully studied language of advertising copywriting itself, the particular words, phrases, and rhetorical techniques that copywriters throughout the decade developed and refined in pursuit of maximum persuasive effectiveness. Certain words and phrases, Research conducted throughout the decade by advertising agencies revealed carried disproportionate persuasive power compared to their ordinary, everyday usage, triggering reliable psychological responses that skilled copywriters learned to deploy with remarkable frequency and consistency across an enormous range of otherwise unrelated products and campaigns. The word "new," perhaps more than any other single term in the entire vocabulary of 1950s advertising, appeared with almost obsessive frequency throughout print and broadcast advertisements of the era, reflecting the industry's sophisticated understanding of just how powerfully American consumers of this particular decade, still basking in the optimistic afterglow of post-war economic expansion and technological progress, responded to any suggestion of genuine innovation and improvement, regardless of whether the underlying product had actually changed in any meaningful way from its previous iteration. Similarly, the phrase "scientifically proven," or close variations of this same underlying claim, appeared throughout an enormous range of advertisements, from legitimate pharmaceutical products through to considerably more dubious tonics and beauty treatments, reflecting the decade's broader cultural reverence for scientific authority and technological progress, a reverence advertisers learned to invoke, often with only the thinnest genuine scientific backing, in service of lending their products an aura of credibility and reliability that a simple, unadorned product description alone could rarely achieve. The specific scientific claims embedded within these advertisements varied enormously in their actual accuracy and rigor, ranging from genuinely accurate descriptions of legitimate product testing through to entirely fabricated claims invoking vague, unnamed laboratories and unspecified research studies that, upon closer examination, simply did not exist in any verifiable form. We'll continue this exploration in the next and final stretches of tonight's story, examining a few remaining threads of this rich and complicated history, including the particular experience of racial and class exclusion within the advertising imagery of the decade, worth acknowledging honestly as part of any complete historical account, before we bring our long evening together to its final, quiet close. Any honest, complete account of American advertising throughout the 1950s must also reckon directly with the significant and troubling patterns of exclusion that characterize the industry's imagery throughout this entire decade. Patterns that reveal important truths about the broader social and racial dynamics of post-war American life. Truths that the glossy, idealized world of advertisement so carefully constructed throughout tonight's story worked hard to obscure or simply ignore entirely. The overwhelming majority of advertisements produced throughout this decade, across virtually every product category and every major publication or broadcast outlet, depicted exclusively white families, white homes, and white communities, presenting this particular, narrow demographic experience as though it represented the entire, unquestioned norm of American life. A presentation that bore little resemblance to the genuine diversity of the actual American population living through this same period. Black Americans, when they appeared at all within mainstream national advertising throughout this decade, were most often relegated to demeaning, stereotyped roles, frequently depicted as domestic servants or in similarly subordinate positions, imagery that reflected and actively reinforced the broader racial hierarchies and prejudices that continued to structure American society throughout this era, particularly, though by no means exclusively within the Jim Crow South. This pattern of exclusion was not, it is important to understand, simply an accident of casting or a passive reflection of existing social prejudice. Advertising agencies throughout this decade made deliberate, calculated decisions regarding exactly which demographic groups to depict within their campaigns, decisions driven in significant part by explicit market research, indicating that many white consumers, particularly though not exclusively within Southern markets, responded negatively to advertisements depicting black families in the kind of aspirational, dignified domestic settings routinely afforded to white families throughout the same advertisements. Rather than challenging this prejudice, the advertising industry throughout this decade largely accommodated, and through its own consistent, repeated imagery, actively reinforced it, contributing to a broader cultural environment in which Black Americans found themselves persistently excluded from the idealized vision of American prosperity and domestic happiness that advertising throughout this decade worked so tirelessly to construct and sell. Black-owned and Black-oriented media outlets, operating largely separately from the mainstream advertising industry we have primarily discussed throughout tonight's story, developed their own parallel advertising landscape throughout this same decade, one that did depict Black families, Black communities, and Black aspiration with considerably more dignity and complexity than mainstream national advertising generally allowed. These publications and broadcast outlets, while considerably more limited in resources and national reach compared to their mainstream counterparts, nonetheless represented an important and often overlooked thread within the broader history of American advertising throughout this decade, offering a genuine, if segregated and under-resourced, alternative to the narrow, exclusionary vision presented throughout the mainstream advertising landscape we have spent most of tonight's story examining. Class 2 structured the imagery of 1950s advertising in ways worth acknowledging honestly. The comfortable, spacious suburban homes, the array of new appliances and automobiles, the general atmosphere of effortless, secure prosperity depicted throughout the vast majority of advertisements produced during this decade, represented a genuinely aspirational, and for a significant portion of the actual American population, entirely unattainable standard of living. Working-class families, families living in genuine poverty, families experiencing the kind of economic precarity that remained a persistent reality for a substantial portion of the American population, even throughout this era of broad post-war prosperity, found themselves largely absent from the advertising imagery of the decade, replaced instead by a carefully curated, idealized vision of middle-class comfort that many advertisements implicitly suggested was not simply one possible American experience, but the natural, default expectation against which any less prosperous reality might be measured, and implicitly found wanting. This particular gap between advertising's idealized vision and the genuine economic diversity of actual American life during this period deserves careful acknowledgement as we near the conclusion of tonight's exploration, because it reminds us that the story we have been telling throughout this long evening, while genuinely revealing important and historically significant truths about the psychology and mechanics of mid-century American advertising, has also, by necessity and by the nature of the advertising industry's own choices during this period, centered a particular, relatively narrow demographic experience, one that, however genuinely representative of a meaningful portion of the American population, by no means captured the full, genuine diversity of American life throughout this complicated, consequential decade. Let's turn now, in these final stretches of our long evening together, toward a broader, more reflective consideration of the lasting legacy of 1950s advertising, drawing together the many threads we have explored throughout tonight's extended story into a final, coherent understanding of exactly why this particular decade continues to hold such significant historical and cultural importance, both for understanding the specific era we have spent tonight exploring and for understanding the broader trajectory of consumer culture that continues to shape contemporary American and indeed global life. The 1950s established, in remarkably comprehensive and enduring form, the fundamental template for what modern advertising would become throughout the remainder of the 20th century and well into our own contemporary moment. The systematic application of psychological research to commercial persuasion, the careful cultivation of parasocial trust through broadcast media personalities, the deliberate engineering of retail environments to maximize impulse purchasing, the strategic use of color, sound, and language to trigger specific emotional responses beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. Each of these techniques, developed and refined throughout the particular decade we have spent tonight exploring, would continue to evolve and adapt across subsequent decades, but would retain, at their core, many of the same fundamental principles first systematically developed and tested throughout the households, supermarkets, and living rooms of 1950s suburban America. Perhaps most significantly, the 1950s established the fundamental cultural assumption, one so thoroughly normalized throughout subsequent decades that it can be difficult to recognize as a historically specific development, rather than simply an unquestionable feature of modern life, that commercial advertising would occupy a near-constant, pervasive presence throughout nearly every dimension of daily American experience. The relatively quieter, more occasional advertising landscape of earlier American eras, in which commercial messaging remained largely confined to specific, bounded contexts, a newspaper advertisement encountered while reading the news, a storefront sign encountered while walking downtown, gave way, throughout precisely the decade we have spent tonight exploring, to something considerably more comprehensive and inescapable. A media and retail environment in which commercial persuasion accompanied nearly every waking hour of daily life, woven seamlessly into entertainment, information, and even the physical architecture of the spaces Americans moved through each day. This transformation, so thoroughly completed by the decade's conclusion that subsequent generations would largely take its basic premises for granted, represents perhaps the single most significant and lasting legacy of the particular historical moment we have spent tonight exploring together. The specific products, jingles, and advertising campaigns we have discussed throughout tonight's story have, for the most part, long since faded from active cultural memory, remembered now primarily by historians, collectors, and those old enough to have experienced them directly during their original broadcast or publication. But the underlying structural transformation these specific campaigns collectively achieved, the establishment of advertising as a pervasive, psychologically sophisticated, and largely inescapable feature of modern life, continues to shape the world we ourselves inhabit today, in ways so thoroughly normalized that we often fail to recognize them as historically specific developments at all, rather than simply the unquestionable, natural condition of modern existence. Let's close tonight's long journey together with one final, quiet return to the particular household and the particular woman whose day we have followed, in various forms and various moments, throughout this entire extended story, allowing ourselves one last, unhurried visit to this specific corner of 1950s American suburban life before we finally let the story rest. It is evening again in the story we have been telling, though we have moved back and forth across so many different hours, so many different moments scattered throughout an entire decade, that the precise date and time hardly matters anymore. What matters is the texture of the moment itself, the particular quality of light filtering through a suburban window, the particular hum of a refrigerator, a radio, a television, the particular rhythm of a household settling, once again, into the quiet rituals of an ordinary evening. She sits now at her kitchen table, the day's dishes finally cleared, a cup of tea cooling beside her, and allows herself, for perhaps the first time throughout the long day we have followed her through, a genuine moment of stillness, unaccompanied by any radio jingle, any television commercial, any glossy magazine spread demanding her attention and her aspiration. It is a small, ordinary moment, the kind that might pass entirely unremarked in the flow of any ordinary day. And yet, within the context of everything we have explored together throughout tonight's long story, it carries its own particular significance, a brief pause within an otherwise near-constant stream of commercial persuasion that had, by this point in the decade, come to structure nearly every waking hour of her daily existence. She thinks in this quiet moment not of any specific product or advertisement, but simply of her children, asleep now upstairs, and of the particular complicated hope she holds for the life they will eventually build for themselves. A hope that exists, in this moment at least, entirely outside the framework of consumption and comparison that has structured so much of her own daily experience throughout the story we have told tonight. This hope is not naive. She understands on some level that her children are growing up within a world even more thoroughly saturated by commercial persuasion than the one she herself came of age within. A world of Saturday morning cartoons interrupted by carefully targeted advertisements, of supermarket aisles engineered specifically to exploit their youthful credulity, of an entire cultural apparatus increasingly sophisticated in its ability to shape desire, identity, and aspiration from the earliest possible age. And yet, within this same quiet moment, she also holds something else, something harder to name but no less real. A genuine, if largely unarticulated, resilience, the same quiet resourcefulness that has carried American households through every previous era of change and upheaval, adapted now to the particular pressures and particular opportunities of her own historical moment. She has, throughout the story we have told tonight, been shown navigating an advertising landscape of extraordinary sophistication and psychological precision, absorbing its messages, succumbing at times to its careful manipulations, and yet also, in scattered, incremental moments throughout our story, beginning to develop her own quiet skepticism, her own emerging critical awareness, her own capacity to recognize, at least occasionally, the careful construction underlying the messages surrounding her. This capacity, however partial and however gradually developed throughout the particular decade we have spent tonight exploring, represents, in its own quiet way, an important and often overlooked thread within the broader history of American consumer culture. The story of 1950s advertising is not simply a story of passive manipulation, of an entire population helplessly absorbing whatever messages a sophisticated commercial apparatus chose to direct toward them. It is also, simultaneously, a story of gradual, incremental resistance, of ordinary Americans slowly developing the critical tools and cultural vocabulary necessary to recognize, question, and eventually push back against at least some of the more manipulative and exploitative practices that had come to characterize the advertising industry throughout this remarkable, transformative decade. Let's take a few more quiet moments together before we finally bring tonight's long story to its close, considering a handful of additional threads worth acknowledging as we near the end of this extended journey through 1950s American advertising and consumer culture. Consider, for instance, the particular experience of rural and small-town Americans throughout this decade, a population whose relationship with the advertising landscape we have primarily discussed throughout tonight's story differed in important, meaningful ways from the specifically suburban experience we have centered throughout much of our narrative. Rural Americans, often living considerably further from the department stores, supermarkets, and other retail environments we have discussed at length, experienced advertising's influence somewhat differently, relying more heavily on the mail-order catalogs we discussed earlier, on radio broadcasts that traveled further and more reliably than the increasingly complex infrastructure required for early television reception, and on a somewhat different rhythm of shopping and consumption shaped by agricultural calendars, seasonal harvests, and the particular economic realities of farm life during this period. The advertising directed specifically toward this rural audience often employed a somewhat different emotional and rhetorical register than the advertising we have primarily discussed throughout tonight's story, leaning less heavily on the specific anxieties of suburban social comparison and more heavily on themes of practical value, durability, and a kind of nostalgic, traditionalist authenticity that resonated particularly strongly with an audience whose daily life remained, in many respects, considerably closer to older, pre-industrial patterns of American life than the thoroughly modernized suburban experience we have centered throughout most of tonight's narrative. Consider, too, the particular experience of American cities during this same decade, urban environments whose relationship with advertising and consumer culture differed in its own distinct ways from both the suburban and rural experiences we have discussed throughout tonight's story. Urban department stores, often considerably larger and more architecturally ambitious than their suburban counterparts, developed their own particular traditions and techniques throughout this decade, competing not simply for individual product sales, but for a broader kind of cultural prestige and civic significance within their respective cities. A competition that produced some of the most elaborate and architecturally significant retail spaces constructed throughout the entire decade. Urban advertising, too, often grappled more directly and more visibly with the demographic diversity that characterized American cities throughout this period, diversity that, as we discussed earlier regarding the broader patterns of racial exclusion characterizing much of mainstream advertising throughout the decade, was often inadequately or exclusionarily represented within mainstream commercial messaging, even as the actual, lived diversity of urban American life continued to expand and evolve throughout these same years, setting the stage for the more significant demographic and cultural transformations that would reshape American cities, and eventually American advertising itself, throughout the subsequent decades of the 20th century. Let's return, finally, to a broader consideration of what this particular decade, examined now from the considerable historical distance separating our own contemporary moment from the specific years we have spent tonight exploring, ultimately reveals about the fundamental nature of human psychology, commercial persuasion, and the ongoing, unresolved tension between genuine human need and manufactured commercial desire that continues to characterize consumer culture throughout every subsequent decade, including, in significant and often underappreciated ways, our own. The advertisers of the 1950s, we should acknowledge honestly as we near the conclusion of tonight's long story, were neither simple villains nor innocent, well-meaning professionals unaware of the genuine consequences of their increasingly sophisticated persuasive techniques. They were, for the most part, ordinary professionals working within a particular historical and economic context, responding to genuine competitive pressures, genuine client demands, and a genuine, evolving understanding of human psychology that they were, in many cases, among the very first professionals in American history to systematically apply toward commercial purposes. Their work produced genuine benefits, genuine conveniences, and genuine improvements in American quality of life throughout this period, even as it simultaneously produced genuine harms, genuine manipulations, and a genuine, lasting transformation of American consumer culture, whose full consequences would not become entirely clear until decades after the particular moment we have spent tonight exploring had passed into history. This complexity, this refusal of any simple, easy moral judgment regarding the advertising industry and the broader consumer culture it helped construct throughout the 1950s, feels, as we near the conclusion of tonight's long journey together, like an appropriate and honest place to rest. The woman whose day, and whose broader decade, we have followed throughout tonight's story was neither a helpless victim of relentless manipulation, nor a fully autonomous, freely choosing consumer navigating an advertising landscape with complete rational clarity. She was, like most people throughout most historical periods, something considerably more complicated. A person navigating a genuinely difficult, genuinely sophisticated commercial environment with whatever combination of genuine desire, manufactured anxiety, critical awareness, and simple practical necessity that any of us might bring to the particular commercial landscape of our own specific historical moment. As tonight's long story finally draws toward its close, let's allow ourselves one final, extended moment of quiet reflection, resting within the particular texture and atmosphere of this remarkable, transformative decade we have spent so many hours exploring together, before we finally let the story, and the evening itself, come to their natural, peaceful conclusion. The house settles into its final quiet of the evening. Outside, the neighborhood dims gradually as televisions switch off one by one across the block, each household completing its own particular version of the ritual we have followed throughout tonight's extended story. The refrigerator hums steadily in the kitchen, its gleaming white surface catching the last faint traces of light before the room finally settles into full darkness. Somewhere upstairs, a child shifts in sleep, dreaming perhaps of cartoon mascots, perhaps of nothing at all, simply resting within the ordinary, unremarkable peace of an ordinary childhood evening. She climbs the stairs one final time, moving through the familiar, well-worn rhythms of her nightly routine, the same routine we described in considerable detail earlier in tonight's story, the careful application of creams and lotions, the quiet ritual of preparing for sleep within a home constructed, furnished, and maintained through years of accumulated purchasing decisions, each one shaped in ways both obvious and subtle by the extraordinary commercial apparatus we have spent this entire evening carefully examining together. And yet, within this same familiar routine, there remains something that no advertisement, no matter how sophisticated, no matter how carefully researched and psychologically calibrated, could ever fully manufacture or fully control. The simple, genuine warmth of a family sleeping safely under one roof, the quiet satisfaction of a day's work completed, however that work might have been shaped and influenced by forces beyond her immediate awareness, and the simple, enduring human capacity for rest, for peace, for the kind of quiet, unhurried stillness that has remained throughout every era of human history, including the particular, remarkable decade we have spent tonight exploring together. Fundamentally beyond the reach of any commercial message, however cleverly constructed. This, perhaps, is where we should finally allow tonight's long story to rest. Not with a final, definitive judgment on the advertising industry of the 1950s, nor with any simple, comforting resolution to the complicated, ongoing tensions between genuine human need and manufactured commercial desire that we have traced throughout this extended journey, but simply with this quiet, unremarkable moment of rest, repeated across millions of American households throughout this remarkable decade, and repeated still, in its own particular contemporary form, across countless households throughout our own present moment, connected across the intervening decades by the same fundamental human need for peace, for stillness, and for genuine rest at the end of a long day. Thank you truly for spending this long evening with me, moving slowly and carefully through the extraordinary, complicated history of 1950s American advertising and consumer culture. We have covered a great deal of ground together tonight. The careful psychological research underlying so much of the era's most effective advertising, the sophisticated engineering of retail environments from the department store to the supermarket, the particular pressures faced by both housewives and husbands throughout this remarkable decade, the specific techniques of color, sound, and language deployed with such careful precision throughout the era's advertising output, and the broader, more troubling patterns of exclusion and manipulation that any honest, complete historical account must acknowledge alongside the genuine innovations and conveniences this same era also produced. If you found yourself drifting toward sleep at any point throughout this long journey, that is exactly as it should be. History, even history as detailed and as carefully examined as what we have explored together tonight, can be a gentle companion for rest, a slow, steady voice accompanying you toward whatever peace and stillness you are seeking this evening. Let the accumulated weight of everything we have discussed settle quietly into the background now, and allow yourself, finally, to rest. Good night, and I will see you again soon, in another quiet corner of history, waiting patiently to be explored together.